Welcome to Victorian Britain, a nation that claimed to be the pinnacle of civilization while quietly tripping over its own moral corset strings. It's the 9th century, and the British Empire stretches across the globe, boasting of progress, prosperity, and principles. But here's the trick. Those principles had a strict dress code. They only applied if you owned property, smelled of lavender rather than coal dust, and didn't have to count your change before buying bread. On the surface, Britain sparkled, literally, if you were standing near a wealthy woman's diamonds or a duke's freshly polished carriage. The Industrial Revolution had turned the nation into a humming machine of factories, steam engines, and innovation. Yet for the millions toiling to keep those engines running, life was less innovation and more indentured inconvenience. Cities ballooned, chimneys belched, and progress came wrapped in soot and misery. For the upper classes, the empire was proof of divine favour. For the working poor, it was proof that God outsourced compassion. This was an age obsessed with morality, as long as morality didn't interfere with profit. The Victorians adored sermons about charity, but not the poor people who required it. They hosted charity balls to raise money for orphans, then passed laws ensuring more children became orphans. Every speech about compassion came with a footnote, does not apply below a certain income bracket. And oh, the hypocrisy was dressed to impress. The upper classes filled parlours with framed mottos, honesty is the best policy, while investing in child labour. Judges thundered about virtue by day, then visited the city's seedier districts by night. Newspapers praised British decency while reporting the latest public flogging. Even Queen Victoria herself, the moral compass of an empire, once referred to the destitute as undeserving of sympathy, proving that royal decorum can coexist beautifully with total lack of empathy. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. In Victorian Britain, law and class were Siamese twins, and guess which one got the brains? The justice system was built like a well-tailored suit. It looked magnificent on the wealthy and suffocated everyone else. Courts, prisons, and police were less about protecting citizens and more about preserving hierarchy. The rich broke laws in private, the poor broke them by existing in public. You didn't need to commit a crime to end up in trouble. You just needed to be poor enough that society assumed you might. Walk down a London street in 1850. The contrast slaps you harder than a factory whistle at dawn. One side glitters with carriages, parasols, and gentlemen in waistcoats so tight they could barely breathe. The other side smells of fish smoke and people who definitely can't afford soap taxed at luxury rates. A man in silk could shout, steal, and swagger. Eccentric. A man in rags who did the same? Vagrant. That's Victorian equality. Everyone's free to behave badly, provided they look rich while doing it. The government, meanwhile, wrapped its class cruelty in the language of reform. Laws were passed to help the poor, the same way a cat helps a bird to the ground. The Poor Laws, the Vagrancy Acts, the Contagious Diseases Acts, all sold as moral guidance, all targeting those who couldn't afford to fight back. It wasn't about justice, it was about order. And order meant keeping poor people where they belonged, visible enough to labour, invisible enough to ignore. In polite society, being rich was proof of virtue. If you were wealthy, it was because God smiled upon your hard work, or, more realistically, your inheritance. If you were poor, it meant you'd sinned somewhere along the way, probably by being born into the wrong family. Victorian moralists genuinely believed poverty was a personal failure, not a structural one. To them, wealth equaled righteousness. Poverty equaled punishment. It was theology with bad math. Even the language reflected it. Newspapers spoke of the deserving poor as if compassion required a membership card. The undeserving ones, they were the reason for every law, curfew, and workhouse. To be poor in Victorian Britain was to live under permanent suspicion, a citizen only when convenient, a criminal the rest of the time. The good news, you had rights. The bad news, they were all reserved for someone richer. But here's the delicious irony. For all their speeches about discipline and restraint, the upper classes were addicted to scandal. They gossiped about each other's affairs, gambled fortunes on horse races, and drank enough port to power a small navy. When they got caught, it was an unfortunate lapse. When a poor man stole bread, it was the collapse of civilization. Victorian morality wasn't about virtue, it was about appearances, and preferably well-dressed ones. As the empire expanded abroad, so too did its double standards at home. The British claimed to bring law and order to the colonies while failing spectacularly to deliver it to their own cities. If you squint hard enough, you might see the pattern. Every law that made Britain moral also made the poor more miserable. Justice wasn't blind, she was busy checking people's credit scores. So as we step into the labyrinth of Victorian law, keep your gloves white and your conscience cleaner. The empire may have been built on coal and colonies, but its true foundation was hypocrisy, polished daily and enforced with polite cruelty. In this world, the courtroom wasn't where fairness lived, it was where fairness went to be laughed at. And with that, let's descend deeper, to see how the law itself became the poor man's prison and the rich man's playground. If the Victorians could have legally outlawed hunger, they would have, and then fined the hungry for non-compliance. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act was not just legislation, it was a declaration of moral warfare on anyone whose pockets echoed when they walked. Its purpose, according to the gentleman who wrote it, was to reform relief for the destitute. In reality, it reformatted compassion into paperwork and humiliation. This was welfare, Victorian style, with all the kindness of a bear trap and twice the efficiency. To understand the cruelty of the act, you first need to appreciate what it replaced. For centuries, England's old poor law, dating back to the Elizabethan era, provided local parish relief. A small stipend, food or occasional work for the desperate. It wasn't generous, but it kept families from starving outright. That system was far too humane for the 19th century, of course. The new industrial age demanded efficiency, and nothing says progress like turning poverty into a crime scene. By the 1830s, the Industrial Revolution had created entire cities full of underpaid, overworked citizens who could barely afford to live. But Parliament, made up almost entirely of wealthy men who thought work was what their servants did, saw poverty not as an economic failure but a moral disease. Their diagnosis: the poor were simply lazy, their cure: make up so painful that only the truly desperate would seek it. In other words, we'll assist you, but first we'll make you wish you'd never asked. Thus, the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 was born. Its core idea was less eligibility, a phrase that sounds bureaucratic but translated roughly to, we'll make welfare worse than starvation. Under the new system, outdoor relief, help you could receive while living at home, was mostly abolished. Instead, the poor were herded into workhouses, grim institutions designed to rehabilitate poverty by punishing it. Imagine a halfway house between a factory, a prison, and a guilt trip, and you're halfway there. Inside these brick fortresses of despair, the rules were simple. You worked for your keep, and your keep was barely edible. Families were separated, husbands, wives and children placed in different wards to discourage the scandalous temptation of affection. Meals were timed, conversations restricted, and every crumb of bread had to be earned. The architects of the system thought this would encourage self-reliance. It mostly encouraged malnutrition and early death. And the diet, legendary. Thin gruel, hard bread, sometimes a spoonful of watery stew if you were lucky, the kind of meal that made you nostalgic for air. Charles Dickens, who had seen the system firsthand, immortalised it in Oliver Twist when little Oliver dares to ask, "Please, sir, I want some more." Victorians laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. The workhouse didn't feed people. It tested how long shame could be sustained on 800 calories a day. To the lawmakers, this was moral improvement. To the poor, it was a bureaucratic form of slow death. The Poor Law Commissioners, 3 unelected men who ran the system, sat in London drafting regulations about people they'd never meet. Their offices were warm, their meals plentiful, and their paperwork spotless. Meanwhile, entire families starved in the name of fiscal discipline. It was the world's first fully administrative conscience, and heaven forbid you try to avoid the system. Those who refused the workhouse found themselves charged under the Vagrancy Acts, their crime being living without visible means. Translation, breathing without money. Even local parishes were fined for showing compassion. If they gave food to a beggar without authorization, they could be punished for encouraging idleness. The Victorian government managed to turn charity itself into contraband. Supporters of the Act claimed it was all for the greater good. They insisted the workhouse would restore dignity through labour, which sounds noble until you realise that labour often meant crushing bones to make fertiliser, picking oakum, teasing tarred rope fibres apart with your fingers, or scrubbing corridors already clean. There was no purpose other than punishment. Workhouses were morality theatres, designed to show the rich that the poor were being taught a lesson. And who built these institutions? Ironically, businessmen who profited from poverty itself. Many contractors supplied food and uniforms to the workhouses. The cheaper, the better. The result? Clothing that disintegrated faster than your will to live and bread, so adulterated with chalk it could double as plaster. The Poor Law made suffering profitable, a Victorian innovation that would echo well into modern bureaucracy. Outside, the public was divided. Some saw the act as monstrous, others applauded its discipline. Newspapers printed stories about workhouse loafers supposedly feasting on taxpayer generosity, which is amusing, considering the average inmate consumed fewer calories than a prison convict. The irony was delicious, unlike anything served in a workhouse. And here lies the moral core of it all. The act was less about saving money than about saving appearances. The rich needed to believe they were virtuous, and virtue demanded someone to look down on. Poverty wasn't treated as a social failure. It was a performance of shame that kept everyone in their proper place. The poor were meant to be visible only as a warning. This could happen to you if you stop working. The Poor Law wasn't just a system, it was a philosophy, one that declared suffering a form of discipline and compassion a form of weakness. It told Britain's poorest citizens that their misfortune was a personal flaw and their salvation depended on obedience. The law didn't want to solve poverty. It wanted to manage it, preferably out of sight and at minimal cost. In short, the Poor Laws turned need into guilt, hunger into evidence, and survival into sin. Imagine welfare that comes with a free side of humiliation and an optional serving of despair. Welcome to 19th century compassion, moral at the pulpit, merciless at the desk. If hell had a front desk and a sign that read, "Now serving the indigent," it would look suspiciously like a Victorian workhouse. These institutions were the proud offspring of the 1834 Poor Law, built on the premise that poverty wasn't a condition, it was a moral failing in need of correction. They were called workhouses because suffering centres didn't sound quite as parliamentary. Picture a building large enough to intimidate you, grey enough to depress you, and cold enough to make your soul put on a second pair of socks. Rows of narrow windows blinked out across factory smoke and filth. A workhouse wasn't built for comfort or even for survival, it was built for deterrence. The logic was simple: make relief so dreadful that the poor would do anything to avoid it. Even starving quietly in an alley seemed like an upgrade. Upon arrival, the first thing a pauper lost was not their hunger, but their identity. Families were immediately separated. Husbands one way, wives another, children in a third direction. For that, apparently, was an inefficient distraction from productivity. Even toddlers were sorted like factory parts. Family life, said reformers, encourages dependence, so they encouraged despair instead. Next came the uniforms, shapeless, scratchy, and colourless, a perfect match for the institutional decor. Every resident wore the same outfit because individuality was dangerous. You weren't a person anymore. You were a problem being processed. The clothing screamed pauper from a mile away, which was the point. Victorian society believed shame built character. The workhouse believed shame built compliance. Meals were a culinary punishment. Breakfast was a thin porridge that could double as wallpaper paste. Lunch might be bread with a whisper of cheese, and dinner was something they called stew, though witnesses swear it defied both smell and description. It was food in the same way coal dust is seasoning. One inspector, shocked at the portion size, remarked that even a sparrow would complain. Humorously enough, the government called this a nutritional improvement. And then, the work. Men were set to crushing stones or breaking bones for fertilizer. Women picked oakum, strands of old rope coated in tar, pried apart until their fingers bled. The children? They cleaned, carried, scrubbed, and occasionally died from exhaustion. This was character building, said officials who had never lifted anything heavier than a wine glass. The labour had no purpose other than punishment, a physical reminder that needing help came at a price. The schedule was regimented with military precision. Wake before dawn, work all day, eat something legally classified as edible, sleep in rows like stacked firewood, repeat. Talking was discouraged, singing was forbidden. Smiling might get you written up for misconduct. It was less a home for the poor and more a crash course in emotional taxidermy. And heaven help you if you complained. Discipline was brutal and creative. Inmates who spoke out could be put in solitary confinement, fed bread and water, or forced into silence rooms where you simply sobbed and regretted your life choices. Think of it as a hotel where the only amenity is regret. Meanwhile, the administrators, known as guardians, ran the place like accountants for misery. They decided rations, punishments, and who was deserving of help. Some were well-meaning but overwhelmed. Others treated cruelty as sport. There are records of guardians deducting meals for minor offences like slouching, but talking or looking insolent. It's unclear how one maintains posture while starving, but apparently it was a moral duty to try. Public opinion was divided, though not evenly. The wealthy praised the workhouses as noble institutions of discipline, conveniently ignoring that their own factories paid wages that funneled people straight into them. The middle classes viewed them with a mixture of fear and smugness, a reminder that hard work kept you respectable and laziness landed you in rags. The poor, of course, viewed them the way a mouse views a cat, inevitable and terrifying. And the numbers tell the story. By the 1850s, there were hundreds of workhouses across Britain, each crammed with the desperate. Entire counties ran their poor populations through these mechanical moralizers. The annual reports boasted of reduced outdoor relief and improved efficiency, as if fewer people starving on the streets proved the system worked. In reality, it proved the poor had vanished inside. The ultimate irony? Many inmates were working people, labourers injured on the job, widows, the elderly, orphans, but the Victorian elite needed to believe poverty was self-inflicted, not systemic. Otherwise, they'd have to face the awkward truth that the empire's prosperity rested on other people's misery. Far easier to blame the victims than to reform the system. Writers and reformers eventually began to expose the horror. Dickens, Mayhew and others dragged public attention toward the reality behind the polished statistics. Scandals occasionally erupted, like the Andover workhouse case where inmates were caught gnawing on animal bones intended for grinding. Parliament gasped in outrage, not at the starvation, but at the publicity. By the late 19th century, reforms trickled in, but the damage was done. Generations grew up believing that help must be earned through degradation. Even after the workhouse system evolved into early welfare structures, the stink of shame lingered. The very word pauper became synonymous with failure. In short, the Victorian workhouse was less a safety net and more a moral obstacle course, one designed to catch the desperate and keep them there. It taught one enduring lesson. In an empire obsessed with respectability, compassion was a luxury item, and only the rich could afford it. Welcome to the workhouse, where hunger was proof of laziness, punishment was therapy, and survival was the only success story. If the Victorians had invented an app to solve homelessness, it would have been called Go to Jail. Because in their eyes, the simplest way to deal with poverty on the streets wasn't to fix it, it was to criminalise it. The Vagrancy Acts were among the most heartless masterpieces of Victorian logic. If you can't afford a roof, you can at least enjoy a prison ceiling. The concept wasn't new. England had been passing vagrancy laws since the 16th century, but the Victorians perfected it with industrial precision. These were people who believed that social order depended on appearance. And nothing ruined the aesthetic of progress like a poor person lying inconveniently near a shop window. So, they made it illegal to be visibly poor. Under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, and its later amendments throughout the 19th century, anyone found wandering abroad, lodging in any barn or outhouse, or pretending to be a fortune teller could be arrested. Yes, homelessness, unemployment, and palm reading were equally criminal offences. You could almost admire the efficiency. As one historian put it, Victorian Britain solved homelessness by simply banning it. Let's imagine the scene. You're a labourer who's lost your job after a factory closure, rent is due, the landlord's patience has expired, and your savings, assuming you ever had any, vanished somewhere between bread and coal. You spend one night on the street and suddenly you're no longer a man down on his luck. You're a vagrant, a rogue, and possibly a suspect in the making. Police patrolled cities like moral gardeners, trimming away anyone who didn't fit the proper social shape. In London, officers were given near total discretion to arrest anyone who appeared idle. Appeared, not was. So if you were standing still too long, resting your feet, or heaven forbid, daydreaming, congratulations, you were breaking the law. The Victorians had criminalised loitering before loitering even knew what it was. Begging too was a punishable offence. The Act referred to beggars as idle and disorderly persons, a phrase that neatly summarised the upper class's opinion of the poor. First offence, up to 1 month in prison. Second offence, hard labour. Third, transported, yes, shipped off to another continent for the crime of asking for bread. Somewhere in Australia there are probably people whose ancestors were deported because they couldn't afford a dinner. The irony was almost artistic. Britain's cities were expanding, factories multiplying, and wealth pouring in from empire, and yet there were thousands with no homes. When industrial workers lost their jobs or rural farmers were displaced by enclosures, they poured into towns in search of work. The jobs didn't always exist, but the police did. Public spaces became zones of surveillance. Street sweepers, crossing guards, and constables weren't just cleaning the city, they were cleaning it of people. The very sight of poverty was seen as contagious, a moral infection that could spread to the respectable. The middle classes wanted to believe poverty was a choice. The Vagrancy Acts made that belief legally enforceable. And what happened to those unlucky enough to be caught? They were hauled before magistrates, who rarely needed much evidence. He looks idle was often enough. Punishments varied. A few days in the cells, a whipping in earlier years, or a stint in a house of correction, a charming Victorian phrase for what was basically a low-budget prison. There, the offender could enjoy a daily diet of stale bread, water, and moral lectures. Of course, the laws were never meant for everyone. If a wealthy man slept off his brandy in a public park, he was indisposed. If a poor man did it, he was a drunken vagabond. A gentleman could stroll aimlessly and be philosophical. A pauper doing the same was loitering with intent. It was the class system, written in handcuffs. Even children weren't spared. Street Arabs, as they were cruelly called, were swept up by police and accused of vagrancy simply for existing without supervision. Some were orphans, others runaways, all treated as future criminals in need of discipline. Reform schools popped up, institutions that promised to save children from a life of crime by introducing them to it early. The newspapers played along, of course. Stories about hordes of vagrants terrorising honest citizens filled the pages, often with the same tone one might use for an incoming plague. It's hard not to laugh or cry when you read editorials describing beggars as invaders. You'd think the poor were marching on Parliament armed with spoons. Even charity was policed. The Charitable Donations Act allowed local authorities to regulate who could legally give money or food to the poor. Helping a beggar might encourage idleness, the logic went. In Victorian Britain, kindness required a permit. The effects were devastating. Thousands cycled between prison, the streets and the workhouse, none of which solved poverty, but all of which recorded it neatly in government ledgers. The system was a revolving door powered by shame. The law didn't ask why someone was homeless, it simply assumed it was their fault. And so Britain's underclass lived under constant threat, not just of hunger, but of being erased. By the late 1800s, reformers began to criticise the cruelty. Journalists and social investigators like Henry Mayhew revealed how many of London's vagrants were simply unemployed labourers. But public sympathy was slow to evolve. Victorian society preferred its poor invisible, its conscience quiet and its streets clean, in that order. In truth, the Vagrancy Acts weren't laws about public order. They were about public image. They ensured that Britain's glittering empire, with its grand boulevards and polished manners, would never be spoiled by the sight of its own failures. If you couldn't afford to live respectably, the least you could do was disappear. Victorian Britain loved efficiency, and they found the most efficient way to make homelessness go away. They made it illegal. Victorian Britain loved numbers. They measured everything: miles of railways, tons of coal, pounds of tea, and most importantly, the precise amount of debt required to ruin a person completely. Because in the empire of manners and ledgers, owing money wasn't just a financial issue, it was a moral failure. To be in debt was to confess your sins against thrift, discipline, and good breeding. And naturally, the punishment for not being able to pay was to be locked somewhere where you definitely couldn't earn the money to pay. Welcome to the world of debtors' prisons, the cruelest financial innovation since compound interest. The logic behind them was gloriously backward. If you couldn't afford a shilling, you could afford 3 months in jail, and it's Victorian math. 1 loaf of bread equals 1 season of damp despair. Excellent exchange rate if you enjoy mildew and hopelessness. The idea was simple enough. When a person failed to pay their debts, whether it was a rent arrear, a shop bill, or even the cost of a funeral, a creditor could have them arrested and imprisoned until they paid up. And if you're wondering how someone was supposed to pay from inside a locked cell, congratulations. You've already identified the system's main feature: futility. By the early 1800s, debtor imprisonment was practically a national sport. England had more than 50 dedicated debtors' prisons, including the infamous Marshalsea, Fleet and King's Bench. These were not prisons for criminals in the usual sense. They were warehouses for the financially unfortunate. Inside their walls you'd find tailors, shopkeepers, widows, and the occasional nobleman who'd miscalculated his gambling streak. And unlike other jails, debtors' prisons operated on a delightful principle. Everything cost money. Want to sell with a window? Pay a fee. Prefer not to share it with 6 coughing strangers? Pay extra. Need food? Buy it yourself or starve politely. Even bedding was charged at a rate that suggested the straw was imported silk. Inmates were literally billed for their incarceration, a genius business model in which the customer could never leave. Families often followed their imprisoned relatives in. Wives and children might live inside with the debtor, trying to keep them alive while selling what few possessions remained. The boundaries between home and prison blurred into something tragic and absurd, a domestic nightmare decorated with iron bars. It was not uncommon for children to grow up behind walls they hadn't earned, learning the alphabet from the graffiti of despair. Outside, society shrugged. The Victorian middle class viewed debt as a sign of moral weakness. "A man who owes," wrote one smug editorial, "has sinned against Providence, which is rich coming from a country that owed half the world through empire." But hypocrisy was cheaper than empathy, and far more fashionable. Within the prisons, life was a hierarchy of misery. The rich debtors, yes, there were tiers, might rent private rooms, dine decently, and even host dinner parties. The poor, meanwhile, rotted in communal cells where disease spread faster than gossip at a tea table. Guards and wardens profited from both, accepting bribes to move prisoners between comfort and squalor. A man could literally buy better morality by the shilling. Take the Fleet Prison, for example, part jail, part marketplace of despair. It was notorious for its liberty of the rules, a charming policy that allowed wealthier inmates to live outside the prison walls as long as they stayed within a certain district and paid the right fees. In short, you could buy your freedom from debt imprisonment, provided you had plenty of money, which naturally you didn't. And then there was the bureaucracy. Upon imprisonment, your possessions were inventoried and often sold, with the proceeds swallowed by court costs. The debt itself remained. Every meal, every candle, every drop of ink used to sign a complaint, all added to your bill. The longer you stayed, the more you owed. It was financial quicksand disguised as justice. The emotional toll was catastrophic. Families were destroyed, reputations permanently stained, and small debts ballooned into life sentences. Many inmates died inside before their debts were cleared, their names forgotten, their accounts permanently unresolved. It was capitalism's cruelest punchline. The price of being poor was death with a receipt. And yet the system persisted for decades because it served an important social function. Fear. The debtor's prison stood as a warning to everyone else. Pay your bills or join the ghosts behind the gate. It kept shopkeepers obedient, labourers cautious, and the illusion of moral order intact. Poverty was not seen as bad luck. It was seen as bad character. Writers like Charles Dickens, who had experienced the system firsthand when his father was imprisoned in Marshalsea, tore the mask off its respectability. Little Dorrit, written years later, immortalised the absurdity of lives spent trapped in financial purgatory. The book's success embarrassed Parliament into reform, because nothing motivates politicians like public shame and paperback sales. By the 1840s and 1850s, reformers began demanding change. Reports revealed that thousands were being jailed each year for debts under Article 21, many for less than 5. The absurdity was becoming difficult to ignore, even for Victorians. One parliamentary witness remarked, "We are jailing the poor for poverty and congratulating ourselves for order." The Debtors Act of 1869 finally abolished imprisonment for most civil debts, though exceptions remained for fraud. In other words, the law stopped jailing people for being broke, unless they were suspiciously broke. But by then the damage was generational. The system had already instilled a national fear of owing, a stigma that lingered long after the prisons closed. The Victorians might have ended debtor imprisonment, but they never stopped blaming the poor for being poor. Financial failure, like sin, remained something to be repented for, not relieved. So what did the great empire achieve by locking people up for pennies? Nothing measurable, except perhaps the invention of despair as public policy. The workhouses broke the body, but the debtor's prison broke the spirit. Together they taught an unforgettable lesson. In Victorian Britain, morality was just math, and both always came with interest. In the end, the debtor's prison wasn't just a building. It was a philosophy made of brick. It whispered the same message as every other law of the age. If you cannot pay your way, you do not deserve to stand in ours. Victorian Britain adored the illusion of order. It was a society that believed silence equaled virtue and noise equaled chaos, unless, of course, the noise came from a factory owned by a gentleman in Parliament. Then it was called progress. For everyone else, sound was suspect. Enter the Victorian Public Order Laws, a delightful collection of rules designed to ensure that only the right people were allowed to make noise, move freely, or, heaven forbid, draw attention to themselves. The goal was simple: to keep the lower classes quiet, compliant, and invisible. Streets were meant for commerce and carriages, not the chatter of the unemployed or the songs of street vendors. Anything that disrupted the polite hum of urban life was labelled a public nuisance. And the Victorians, being experts in moral overreaction, defined nuisance as broadly as humanly possible. Street vendors shouting their wares, disorderly conduct, street performers singing for coins, disturbing the peace, a man arguing politics at a corner, sedition, a woman laughing too loudly, indecency, a group of unemployed men standing around in conversation, riot in progress. In short, if you made noise, you were a criminal. If you were silent, you were suspicious. The irony, of course, was that the very people targeted by these laws were the ones who lived on the street, not by choice but by necessity. London, Manchester, Birmingham, every industrial city overflowed with workers, hawkers, musicians, and beggars trying to earn a coin or two from passers-by. For many, shouting fresh mackerel, 2 a penny wasn't rebellion, it was survival. But to the respectable middle classes, it sounded like anarchy in G major. And so the state obliged. Under a patchwork of local ordinances and national laws, like the Town Police Clauses Act of 1847, police were empowered to arrest anyone causing annoyance in public spaces. Annoyance wasn't defined naturally. It was whatever a constable decided it was that morning. This gave the authorities an all-purpose tool for removing undesirable elements, meaning the poor, the eccentric, and anyone whose face looked insufficiently expensive. Let's imagine you're a street musician in 1850 London. You've got a battered violin, a good tune, and an audience of small children and passing drunks. One constable strolls by and tells you to move along and you're blocking the way. You move. Another tells you to stop playing and you're disturbing the peace. You stop. Then a third arrests you for loitering without intent. Congratulations. You've completed the Victorian hat-trick of criminality. Performers, or street nuisances, as the polite press called them, were often fined or imprisoned for the sin of being interesting. Organ grinders, wildly popular among the working class but despised by anyone with property, became the ultimate symbol of class annoyance. One London magistrate declared that organ grinders were a public scourge upon civilised life. Their crime, making music within earshot of people who could afford walls. Meanwhile, the unemployed were policed just as harshly. Groups of men waiting outside labour exchanges or congregating near factories were viewed as potential mobs. The police dispersed them for public safety, which really meant for upper-class comfort. After all, nothing ruined a morning carriage ride like the sight of too many people without money. Public meetings, the Victorian version of free speech, were another casualty of the order at all costs mentality. Any gathering of workers, political activists or reformers could be declared an unlawful assembly if it caused alarm to respectable citizens. The Unlawful Societies Act and later local bylaws gave police near limitless power to arrest speakers and dissolve crowds. It was said that in Victorian Britain, the only safe protest was one that politely agreed with the government. Even street preaching fell under suspicion. Evangelical preachers shouting about salvation competed with sellers shouting about sausages, and both could be arrested if their enthusiasm exceeded upper-class tolerance levels. One preacher was famously fined for interrupting the passage of a horse-drawn omnibus with excessive piety. Truly, no one loved irony like the Victorians. Of course, the law didn't apply evenly. The same police who arrested a cobbler for selling bootlaces too loudly would salute a duke's carriage as it thundered through the same street at twice the noise level. Wealth exempted one from disturbing the peace. It wasn't the decibels that mattered. It was the social rank of the person making them. The public order laws also targeted what Victorians called improper behaviour. This included swearing, dancing, gambling, public affection, or, heaven forbid, laughing after dark. London even had curfew acts in some districts, allowing constables to clear the streets after certain hours. Poor people wandering home from work could be stopped and questioned on suspicion of wandering without cause. There was always cause, of course. Rent, hunger, or exhaustion. But those weren't legally valid excuses. To justify these measures, officials claimed they were protecting public morality. After all, A noisy poor person might lead to disorder, and disorder was the gateway drug to revolution. The upper classes had seen what happened in France a few decades earlier, and they weren't about to let it happen in Piccadilly. So in the name of peace, Britain turned its cities into silent theatres of obedience. The absurdity of it all didn't go unnoticed. Satirical papers like Punch delighted in mocking overzealous constables who arrested a man for whistling without a licence. Reformers, too, pointed out that the laws punished the symptoms of poverty while ignoring its causes. But satire did little to soften reality. For many, the streets remained a minefield of invisible laws. One wrong word, one wrong note, and you could end up in a cell. By the late 19th century, urban policing had grown into a full-blown social performance. Constables maintaining the illusion of calm for the benefit of those who could afford to believe in it. The rich enjoyed quiet streets, the poor endured silent suffering. Order had been achieved if you ignored the hunger humming beneath it. In the end, the Victorian obsession with quiet wasn't about serenity, it was about control. The empire feared noise because noise meant visibility, and visibility meant truth. And the truth was loud, messy, and poor. In short, the public order laws turned human existence into a regulated performance. To live respectably, one had to make neither sound nor scene. The only acceptable noise was the polite rustle of money changing hands. Everyone else? Well, they were just disturbing the peace. Of all the laws Victorian Britain used to keep the lower classes in their place, none were more absurdly feudal or more deadly than the game laws. These were the rules that governed who could hunt, what could be hunted, and when. In theory, they protected wildlife. In practice, they protected privilege. Because while the rich were free to slaughter animals by the dozen for sport, the poor could be jailed for catching a rabbit to survive. The logic was as twisted as the hedgerows that lined the estates. In Victorian Britain, nature itself had a landlord. Every pheasant, hare and deer that roamed the countryside technically belonged to the landowner whose fields it wandered across. Even the birds in the sky, it seemed, had signed a social contract with the aristocracy. To take one without permission wasn't just theft. It was poaching, a crime treated with the seriousness of treason. The roots of these laws stretched back centuries, but the Victorians perfected their cruelty with bureaucratic polish. By the early 1800s, the Game Acts had become a tangle of statutes designed to ensure that hunting remained the exclusive hobby of those who could afford to waste food. To legally shoot a pheasant, one needed a game licence, and the fees were laughably out of reach for ordinary people. To hunt without one was a crime. To possess an animal killed by someone without one was also a crime. To look hungry in the direction of a pheasant might not have been codified in law, but it was definitely grounds for suspicion. For the working poor who lived in rural areas and depended on small game to supplement their meagre diets, these laws were a death sentence disguised as moral order. Imagine it's winter, 1842. Your children are hungry, the fields are barren, and you spot a fat rabbit on the edge of a lord's estate. You set a snare, a simple wire trap. The next morning, the local gamekeeper finds it. By nightfall, you're in jail. By the end of the week, you're in court, facing months of hard labour for the heinous crime of feeding your family. Shoot a pheasant, felony. Starve quietly, civic duty. And it wasn't just pheasants. Rabbits, hares, partridges, pigeons all fell under the sacred umbrella of game. Even picking up a dead bird could get you arrested. The landowners' gamekeepers patrolled the countryside like private militias, armed with authority and, more literally, guns. They were the eyes and fists of the gentry, enforcing the idea that nature was not a common right but a luxury product. The tension this created was explosive. The poor saw poaching as survival, the rich saw it as rebellion. In many villages, the poacher became a kind of folk hero, part outlaw, part breadwinner. Songs and ballads celebrated daring men who crept into the Lord's woods at night and slipped away with their prize. But romantic as those tales sound, the reality was brutal. The law treated poachers as violent criminals, and gamekeepers had legal protection to shoot them on sight. The early 19th century saw an epidemic of poaching riots. pitched battles between gangs of hungry labourers and the armed servants of the aristocracy. Entire families were torn apart when fathers or sons were caught and imprisoned. Some were transported to penal colonies in Australia, yes, exiled across the planet for the crime of catching dinner. Others were hanged. All this to preserve a few more pheasants for the weekend shooting party, and the hypocrisy as thick as the forest fog. Wealthy gentlemen regularly shot thousands of birds in sporting weekends, their trophies piled like small feathery mountains. They called it conservation. The poor man who snared one for stew was branded a menace to civilization. It was class warfare waged with shotguns and statutes. The justifications were almost comical. The gentry argued that poaching threatened social order. If a labourer could steal a rabbit, what would stop him from stealing a cow? Answer: common sense and a lack of refrigeration. They claimed that protecting game preserved moral discipline among the lower ranks. In truth, it preserved the illusion that landowners were not just rich, they were ordained by nature itself. Magistrates, often landowners themselves, were enthusiastic in their sentencing. Newspapers reported cases where men were given 6 months for taking a single hare, while others were whipped for possessing traps. One magistrate famously sentenced a boy to hard labour for picking up a dead partridge with suspicious intent. That's right, you could commit a Victorian thought crime with your hands. For many in rural Britain, the game laws became the most visible symbol of class tyranny. Reformers called them the most oppressive code ever written in a free country. The laws were so despised that even Parliament couldn't ignore the growing outrage. Gradually small reforms crept in. The Game Act of 1831 loosened some restrictions, allowing anyone who could pay for a licence to hunt. But as usual, anyone meant anyone rich enough. The poor remained firmly outside the club, their hunger still a criminal offence. By the late 19th century, industrialisation had shifted the battleground. As rural poverty gave way to urban poverty, the game laws faded slightly from public fury, replaced by the equally absurd laws that policed city life. But their legacy lingered. They had turned Britain's countryside into a moral fortress, where nature itself became private property, and hunger a legal liability. The real tragedy of the game laws wasn't just the suffering they caused, it was the mindset they represented. They embodied the Victorian belief that class dictated morality. The rich could indulge every appetite, the poor were expected to rise above theirs. A gentleman's bullet was noble, a labourer's snare was theft, the pheasant might as well have worn a monocle. In the end, the game laws weren't about animals. They were about authority, about teaching the poor their place in the natural order of things, below the birds, beneath the deer, and miles away from the table. So the next time someone calls the Victorians the founders of modern civilization, remember, this was a world where a rabbit had more legal protection than a hungry child. If there's one thing the Victorians loved more than judging others, it was pretending to do it sober. The Beerhouse Acts were a perfect example of moral engineering disguised as public health, a set of laws meant to protect the working class from drunkenness, while conveniently ignoring that the upper class was marinating in brandy. Because in Victorian Britain, drinking wasn't about alcohol, it was about class. A duke drunk on brandy was merry. A coal miner with a pint was a menace to society. To understand why the Beerhouse Acts came about, we need to step into Britain's 19th century tavern scene, a social universe that terrified reformers and delighted everyone else. Industrialisation had driven millions into cities, where long work hours, grim housing, and shorter lifespans made beer one of the few reliable pleasures. Taverns, gin shops, and alehouses weren't just drinking spots. They were community centres, newsrooms, and cheap therapy sessions all rolled into one. But to the moral crusaders in Parliament, who saw society as one large misbehaving servant, this casual drinking looked like chaos. The working poor, they argued, were wasting their wages, corrupting their souls, and clogging the moral drains of the empire. The answer? Regulate drinking until it became a crime of enthusiasm. The first Beerhouse Act of 1830 started as a curious experiment. Ironically, it was supposed to reduce drunkenness by making beer cheaper and more accessible. The idea was to wean the working class off gin, the so-called mother's ruin that had devastated 18th century London, and replace it with the safer, weaker drink of beer. So Parliament threw open the taps, allowing anyone who could pay 2 guineas for a licence to sell beer from their home. For a brief, glorious moment, Britain turned into one giant brewery. Beer houses sprang up on every corner, run by blacksmiths, widows, bakers, even ex-soldiers with a spare room and a barrel. By 1840, there were over 40,000 new establishments. The working class rejoiced, affordable beer, friendly neighbours, and no need to dress respectably. It was democracy in a mug, but that of course was the problem. The middle and upper classes took one look at this nationwide beer bonanza and collectively clutched their pearls. Respectable citizens complained that the beer houses were dens of vice, where men idled, gossiped, and occasionally sang. The Times called them nurseries of crime. The Church declared them moral sinkholes. Parliament, panicking that the poor were enjoying themselves unsupervised, rushed to fix its mistake. Enter the later Beer House Acts, particularly the one in 1869, which slammed the brakes on working-class merriment. The new rules demanded stricter licensing, higher fees, and police oversight. Beer houses were subjected to inspections, curfews, and endless paperwork. Landlords needed good character references, preferably from people who didn't frequent beer houses themselves. In short, the empire declared war on cheap happiness. The justifications were dripping with moral syrup. Officials claimed the poor drank to excess, neglected their families, and descended into disorder. Reformers spoke of protecting the labourer from his own weakness. It was paternalism at its finest, as if the nation's landlords and lawmakers hadn't been drunkenly signing bills for decades. The hypocrisy was staggering. While reformers scolded the poor for beer, the wealthy guzzled champagne like hydration was a sin. Aristocrats boasted wine cellars that could drown a small village. Dinner parties flowed with port, claret and sherry, all supposedly civilised drinks, of course. The difference wasn't what you drank, but where and with whom. A miner in a tavern was a disgrace. A countess in a ballroom with her 3rd glass of Bordeaux was graceful. Even the language betrayed this double standard. The poor got drunk, the rich overindulged. The poor rioted, the rich celebrated. Moral outrage always seemed to stop at the edge of an estate. For working people, the crackdown hit hard. Beer houses had been affordable refuges, a place to rest after a 14-hour shift, to swap news, to forget hunger for an hour or two. When the new regulations arrived, thousands of establishments closed overnight. The survivors had to raise prices, cutting off the very customers they were meant to serve. The same Parliament that had flooded Britain with beer now acted shocked that people were wet. Meanwhile, the police gained yet another reason to arrest the poor. Under the new laws, anyone found drunk in public could be fined or imprisoned. Public drunkenness became a favourite charge for rounding up the unemployed or homeless. It didn't matter whether you had had 1 pint or 6, the constable's opinion was law. And then came the temperance movement, a coalition of well-intentioned zealots and professional buzzkills who saw alcohol as the root of all evil. They preached abstinence from pulpits, printed pamphlets filled with horror stories and built temperance halls as sober alternatives to pubs. But these halls lacked the laughter, warmth and cheap ale that made the tavern beloved. Unsurprisingly, attendance was sparse. Nothing kills a night out like moral superiority served lukewarm. The temperance crowd insisted that sobriety would lift the working class out of poverty. What they never mentioned was that poverty drove the drinking in the first place. When your wages barely bought bread and your home smelled like coal dust and damp despair, a pint wasn't a vice. It was survival with bubbles. Yet the government, ever fond of easy solutions, continued to legislate morality instead of improving lives. The Beer House Acts didn't cure drunkenness. They just privatised it, pushing drinking back into slums and alleys, out of sight of those who claimed to be helping. Out of sight, out of mind, and therefore out of moral concern. By the late 19th century, respectable Victorians could toast empire expansion over fine wine while condemning a dock worker for raising a pint to his day's wages. It was the perfect hypocrisy. Virtue for the rich, vigilance for the poor. In the end, the Beerhouse Acts were less about sobriety and more about social control. They weren't written to stop drinking, they were written to stop the wrong people from drinking. Victorian Britain wasn't scared of alcohol, it was scared of equality. The poor finding joy even briefly in something that didn't come with permission. So yes, the laws might have reduced public drunkenness, but they also revealed something far more intoxicating: the empire's addiction to class hierarchy. In Victorian Britain, the bottle wasn't the problem, it was who dared to lift it. Victorian Britain didn't trust the working class with two things: opinions and alcohol. The first they silenced with the law, the second they smothered with red tape. Welcome to the world of Victorian licensing laws. A labyrinth of moral micromanagement where owning a pub required more paperwork than performing brain surgery, and arguably did more emotional healing. For the Victorians, the pub wasn't just a place to drink, it was a potential breeding ground for chaos, sedition and laughter, all equally alarming to respectable society. A pub meant people gathering. Gathering meant talking. Talking meant opinions. And opinions, to the ruling class, were one small step from revolution. So Parliament, in its infinite wisdom, decided that every pint needed a permission slip. By the mid-19th century, Britain was drowning in legislation about alcohol. There were alehouse acts, beerhouse acts, and licensing acts, each one more moralistic than the last. The underlying philosophy was simple: if the working class was enjoying itself, it must be regulated immediately. Every publican, pub owner, had to obtain a licence, which wasn't a simple matter of paperwork. Licences were granted or denied by local magistrates, men who usually didn't frequent pubs themselves unless the wine list was impressive. Applicants had to prove good character, meaning no criminal record, no moral stains, and ideally, a social standing high enough to reassure the court that they wouldn't let the riffraff have too much fun. And these licenses weren't permanent. They had to be renewed annually, at the mercy of whichever magistrate happened to wake up judgmental that morning. Any accusation of disorderly conduct serving an unsuitable customer, allowing a sing-along after hours, could mean losing your livelihood. One inspector noted that a publican could be ruined for permitting the taproom to appear cheerful. Cheerfulness apparently was a gateway drug. Operating hours were another battlefield. The Licensing Act of 1872 introduced strict opening and closing times, declaring that pubs must shut their doors by 11 p.m. on weekdays and earlier on Sundays. The logic was that the working man, left to his own devices, would drink himself into moral ruin by midnight. So naturally the government decided to save him by forcing him out into the cold earlier, where presumably he could reflect soberly on his sins while catching pneumonia. To make sure the new laws stuck, the state empowered the police to enforce them with religious zeal. Constables patrolled outside pubs, timing exits and sniffing for signs of joy. They lurked in doorways, listening for laughter. If someone inside so much as raised their voice, it could be recorded as disorderly behaviour. And woe betide the landlord caught serving after hours. Fines were steep, and repeat offenders could lose their licence entirely. Publicans quickly learned to play defence. Many installed clocks conspicuously near the bar, set slightly fast to avoid accidents. Some trained barmaids to look innocent and apologetic under interrogation. Others developed a skill that every Victorian pubkeeper needed: the art of pretending not to notice anything illegal happening in plain sight. Of course, the laws didn't apply equally to everyone. Private clubs, the kind where gentlemen discussed politics and investments over cigars, were exempt from many licensing restrictions. A working man's beer at 10:45 was immoral. A banker's brandy at 2 a.m. was civilised. Once again, morality depended on who was holding the glass. The official justification for this legal overkill was public order. Reformers claimed that limiting pub hours would prevent crime and domestic violence and poverty. But in practice, the restrictions only drove drinking underground. Illegal, after-hours dens flourished, and police raids became part of the nightly entertainment. Newspapers gleefully reported on drinking clubs hidden behind fake storefronts, a tailor's shop by day, a raucous bar by night. Victorian hypocrisy, it seemed, could hold its liquor. And then there were the Sunday closing laws, designed to give the working class a day of rest, which in practice meant a day of forced sobriety. For devout moralists, this was a triumph. For everyone else, it was an inconvenience wrapped in sanctimony. Workers who toiled 6 days straight often saw Sunday as their only day of leisure. But leisure without beer was frankly blasphemy. Some resorted to travelling loopholes, riding trains to neighbouring towns with different licensing hours. It was pilgrimage by pint. The licensing laws also created a peculiar cultural side effect: the rise of the tea temperance movement. Sober halls and coffee houses popped up as moral alternatives to pubs, promising clean entertainment and wholesome fellowship. Unfortunately, they offered conversation as weak as their tea. One patron famously described a temperance meeting as like a funeral but with worse music. Needless to say, most working men stuck with the pubs. By the 1880s, debates over licensing had become a national obsession. Reformers demanded tighter control while brewers and publicans fought back, arguing that they provided a necessary social service, a safety valve for the overworked masses. They had a point. The pub was more than a place to drink. It was a community centre, an informal employment office, a marriage bureau, and, in many cases, the only warm room within walking distance. The government might have seen sin, but the people saw survival. Despite endless tinkering, the licensing laws never truly achieved their stated goal of moral improvement. What they did achieve was a kind of social choreography, an elaborate dance in which the poor learned when and how to be publicly respectable. They could drink, but not too much, laugh, but not too loud, be merry, but not visibly, and through it all, the publicans, those long-suffering custodians of Britain's collective sanity, carried on. They memorised 1,000 regulations, filled out endless forms, and quietly kept the nation lubricated enough to endure its own hypocrisy. They were therapists with tankards, priests with ale taps, and if you ask the average Victorian labourer who truly kept the empire running, the answer wasn't Parliament or the Queen. It was the bloke behind the bar who poured in one more before closing time. In the end, Victorian licensing wasn't about alcohol, it was about control. The government didn't fear drunkenness, it feared independence. A man in a pub might start thinking, talking, even organising, and that in the empire of order and decorum was the most intoxicating danger of all. Victorian Britain, an empire that could design railways across continents but couldn't quite grasp the concept of equality. Nowhere was that clearer than in the Contagious Diseases Acts, a series of laws passed between 1864 and 1869 that managed to combine medicine, morality, and misogyny into one disturbingly efficient system. Officially, they were meant to protect public health. Unofficially, they were the government's way of telling working-class women, if a man got sick, the woman got arrested. Victorian logic, now with extra patriarchy. The problem, or so Parliament claimed, was venereal disease. The British Army and Navy were suffering from high infection rates among soldiers and sailors, particularly those stationed in garrison towns and port cities. The authorities, desperate to maintain military efficiency, began to worry that the nation's soldiers were too busy losing their morals and other things to local prostitutes. Clearly something had to be done. Naturally, that something involved punishing the women. The Contagious Diseases Acts gave police sweeping powers in certain towns to stop, detain and examine any woman suspected of being a prostitute. No trial, no evidence, no complaint. Suspicion alone was enough. And suspicion was as elastic as a Victorian corset. A woman walking alone at night, suspicious. A woman talking to soldiers, suspicious. A woman breathing near a naval base, highly suspicious. Once accused, she could be forced to undergo an invasive medical examination by a government-appointed doctor, often without consent. If found to be infected, she was detained in a lock hospital for treatment, which could last up to 3 months. And if she refused the exam, straight to prison for insubordination. The laws didn't just police disease, they policed womanhood itself. Meanwhile, the men who actually spread these infections, the soldiers, sailors, and respectable gentlemen visiting brothels on their off nights, faced no punishment whatsoever. The assumption was that men were biologically incapable of self-control, while women were morally responsible for everyone's self-indulgence. It was as if the government had decided that the human body was a battlefield, and women were both the enemy and the terrain. The system was supposedly scientific, which made it even worse. Doctors inspected thousands of women under conditions that today would qualify as state-sanctioned assault. There were no guarantees of cleanliness, privacy, or dignity, just cold tables, rough instruments, and the smug assurance of medical men convinced they were saving civilization one humiliated woman at a time. Reports describe some women fainting from pain, others weeping in silence. Some never returned home, their reputations destroyed. To the Victorians, this was called regulation. To anyone with a conscience, it was control disguised as cleanliness. The government justified the acts with chillingly bureaucratic language. They were a public health measure to protect the efficiency of Her Majesty's armed forces. In plain English, that meant protect the men, sacrifice the women. The cruelty went deeper still. Many of the women targeted weren't sex workers at all. Laundresses, seamstresses, and factory girls, anyone poor enough to live near barracks, could be swept into the system. Once examined, their names were recorded in police registers. Their reputations were permanently tainted. A single accusation could destroy a life. Once labelled a fallen woman, it was almost impossible to find work or housing again. Poverty, ironically, was the disease that most often proved contagious. And of course, class determined the rules. Upper-class women, even those caught in genuine scandals, were considered victims of circumstance. Working-class women, by contrast, were presumed guilty by default. The logic was flawless. If you were poor, you must also be immoral. The empire had built an entire moral code on the premise that vice smelled like cheap perfume, but Victorian hypocrisy, as always, overplayed its hand. By the 1870s, opposition began to rise, led by one of the most formidable reformers of the age, Josephine Butler. A clergyman's wife with the moral courage of 10 generals, Butler took one look at the Acts and declared war. She called them a foul outrage upon women, and the most infamous law ever passed by the English Parliament. And she didn't just write pamphlets, she spoke publicly, loudly, and with the full fire of righteous fury. Her campaign shocked polite society. A woman discussing venereal disease in public was practically unthinkable. It violated every rule of Victorian decorum, but Butler's sheer force of will tore through that silence. She and her fellow campaigners, mostly middle-class women, toured the country holding rallies, publishing testimonies and naming the cruelty for what it was. Their opponents called them hysterical. Parliament called them immodest. History now calls them right. The Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts gathered thousands of signatures and built alliances with working-class women, doctors, and even some radical MPs. The movement exposed not only the gender bias of the laws, but also their sheer inefficiency. Despite all the inspections, disease rates among soldiers barely declined. Apparently, humiliation wasn't a cure for syphilis after all. By the mid-1880s, public pressure forced the government's hand. The Acts were suspended in 1883 and formally repealed in 1886, but the damage lingered long after. Generations of women bore the scars, physical, psychological, and social, of a system that had turned them into scapegoats for men's sins. The Contagious Diseases Acts revealed, with perfect clarity, the Victorian contradiction. A society obsessed with morality that had no idea what morality actually meant. They treated women's bodies as public property, regulated by the state in the name of protection. Protection for whom? Not for the women, certainly, only for the delicate egos of men who couldn't be trusted to behave. In the end, these laws weren't about health. They were about hierarchy. the empire's eternal habit of controlling those who couldn't fight back, the Victorians thought they were curing vice. What they really perfected was hypocrisy, a nation drunk on its own righteousness, convinced that sin existed only in a woman's shadow. If Victorian Britain could be summed up in one sentence, it might be this: adore children unless they're poor, illegitimate, or making noise in public. Nowhere did this selective morality shine brighter than in the bastardy clauses, those delightful legal inventions that turned unmarried motherhood into both a scandal and a sentencing. Victorian law treated unmarried mothers as if poverty were contagious, and it usually was, just not how they thought. To the Victorian mind, nothing was more sacred than family values. It was the era's moral centrepiece, endlessly preached from pulpits, printed in newspapers, and engraved into the nation's conscience like embroidery on a sampler. Marriage equals virtue, motherhood equals holiness, but only if you've signed the paperwork first. The bastardy clauses were born out of the same legislative fever that produced the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, the empire's great social sorting machine. Their goal, in theory, was to stop immorality and discourage irresponsible behaviour among the lower classes. In practice, they did what most Victorian laws did: punish women for existing in ways that inconvenienced men. Before 1834, an unmarried mother could apply for financial support from the child's father through a parish hearing. The man, if identified and found guilty, would be ordered to pay maintenance for the child. Not much, but enough to keep mother and baby from starving. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Then Parliament decided it was too generous. The new poor law changed everything. Under the new bastardy clauses, single mothers could no longer seek financial support from the fathers of their children, lest they proved paternity in court, an almost impossible task for women with no money, no lawyer, and a society eager to call them liars. And if she couldn't prove it, the entire burden fell on her shoulders. Her sin became a public expense, and worse, a public shame. The reasoning was as cruel as it was predictable. Lawmakers argued that providing support to unmarried mothers encouraged immorality. If the state or the parish helped her, it might tempt other women to commit the same dreadful crime of falling in love without a wedding ring. To prevent such moral contagion, Parliament effectively declared single motherhood a self-inflicted wound and withdrew the bandages. In the moral calculus of the time, men were ruled by passion, while women were expected to be the guardians of chastity. So when things went wrong, the logic was simple. The man was weak, but the woman was wicked. The Poor Law Commissioners claimed that denying assistance would restore virtue to the nation. Instead, it restored misery to tens of thousands of women. For unmarried mothers, survival options were grim. Some were forced into the workhouse, where they faced separation from their babies and relentless humiliation. Officials treated them as living morality lessons, fallen women to be reformed through labour and repentance. Their children, meanwhile, were branded bastards in official registers, a word that carried lifelong stigma. Employers, landlords, and even schools might reject a child for that single word written beside their name. Others tried to hide their pregnancies entirely. Some sought work in distant towns, passing themselves off as widows. Many gave birth in secret, often without medical help. And, in too many tragic cases, desperation led to infanticide or abandonment, acts born not of cruelty, but of absolute hopelessness. Yet society, blind to its own role in creating these tragedies, condemned such women as monsters. The press joined the chorus. Newspapers printed scandalized editorials about the moral rot of illegitimacy, painting unmarried mothers as parasites draining parish funds. Meanwhile, stories of wealthy men abandoning their mistresses and children rarely made it past the gossip column. Respectability, like justice, was for those who could afford it. The laws also punished the poor collectively. Because mothers could no longer compel fathers to pay, the financial responsibility fell to the parish, meaning everyone's taxes were theoretically paying for someone else's immorality. This was all the excuse the self-righteous middle classes needed to clutch their pearls and demand stricter enforcement. Poverty, they insisted, was the natural consequence of sin, and thus proof that the system worked. It was a vicious cycle of logic. Poor because immoral, immoral because poor. The bastardy clauses turned morality into math, with the mother's reputation as the balance sheet. But not everyone bought the sanctimonious nonsense. Social reformers, especially women, began to speak out against the hypocrisy. Caroline Norton, a writer and activist whose own husband denied her access to her children after their separation, became one of the loudest critics. She argued that the laws didn't protect virtue, they punished vulnerability. Her writing sparked debates about women's legal rights, helping lay the groundwork for later reforms like the Infant Custody Acts and eventually the Married Women's Property Act. Still, change came at a glacial pace. The stigma surrounding illegitimacy persisted deep into the century. Fallen women were treated as moral contagions to be quarantined in Magdalen homes, grim institutions where they were confined, made to sew or scrub endlessly, and told to repent their existence. The fathers, of course, were free to continue spreading both disease and denial with impunity, and the hypocrisy reached sublime heights. Victorian society adored the image of the pure self-sacrificing mother, provided she was married, middle class and photogenic. The unmarried mother, by contrast, was the empire's scapegoat, proof that morality needed policing and that female independence was dangerous. It wasn't poverty they feared most, but women surviving without permission. By the late 19th century, pressure from reformers forced minor revisions. The Bastardy Acts of 1872 and 1873 made it slightly easier for mothers to claim maintenance, but only slightly. The social stigma, meanwhile, never left. Even decades later, being born illegitimate carried a mark society refused to erase. The bastardy clauses revealed how Victorian morality worked in practice, as a tool of punishment disguised as virtue. It wasn't enough for women to be poor. They had to be publicly shamed for it. The law didn't just deny them support, it denied them dignity. It was less about preventing sin and more about maintaining the social order, one where men's mistakes were natural and women's consequences were eternal. In the end, the bastardy clauses didn't just criminalize motherhood, they redefined it. To be a good mother, one had to be respectable, married and silent. Anything else was a scandal. And for those who failed to fit that mould, Victorian Britain had a simple solution: moral lectures, legal abandonment, and a very cold room in a very public workhouse. If Dickens had written police reports instead of novels, this chapter would have read like satire. Suspect apprehended for selling matches while under the influence of hunger. Estimated age 10. Victorian Britain had a gift for turning necessity into illegality. And nowhere was that talent more finely honed than in its treatment of working children. In an empire that prided itself on industry and morality, it somehow decided that a starving child selling newspapers was more dangerous than the factory owner exploiting him. By the mid-19th century, Britain's streets were full of children working, not because they were rebels or entrepreneurs, but because they were the only thing standing between their families and starvation. Boys hawked papers, swept crossings, polished boots and carried parcels. Girls sold flowers, matches or watercress, often from dawn until well past midnight. Some pulled carts through snow, some sang for pennies, and all of them learned early that life had no patience for small stomachs. To the upper classes, these children were unsightly proof that civilization wasn't as tidy as their parlours. To Parliament, they were a social problem. To the police, they were an opportunity for arrest. The street trading acts and child labour regulations that followed were sold as moral reform, an effort to rescue children from vice and idleness. In practice, they rescued them from earning dinner. The first wave of laws came cloaked in benevolence. The Factory Acts of the early 1800s limited the hours children could work in mills. It sounded compassionate until you looked closer. Those limits were set at 12 hours a day. Then, as the decades rolled on, lawmakers realised that reform made for excellent publicity. By mid-century, politicians were competing to pass new restrictions on where children could work, what they could sell, and how old they had to be, as if bureaucracy could replace bread. But while factory labour was at least acknowledged, street labour, the work of the urban poor, was viewed as moral contamination. Policemen patrolled markets and alleys, hauling in child vendors who lacked trading licences or obstructed the pavement. Those licences, of course, cost money, and the children selling matches could barely afford shoes. It was poverty's cruel punchline: to earn legally, you had to start off rich enough to register. You're 10 years old selling matches and freezing? Congratulations, you're now a legal menace. The justification for this madness was, as always, morality. Reformers fretted that the streets exposed children to corruption. They feared pickpocketing, gambling, bad language, and, worst of all, independence. The state's solution was not to improve living conditions, but to criminalize the symptom. Arrest the child, they reasoned, and you arrest the problem. Inspectors and philanthropists wrote endless reports describing the wretched little traders of London. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, 1861, captured their lives in heartbreaking detail. Barefoot boys crying papers, morning papers, through fog, flower girls shivering by gaslight, match sellers crushed by the horse carts in the dark. He estimated that tens of thousands of children depended entirely on street trading to survive. Yet the government responded not with aid, but with fines and reformatories. Reformatories, another Victorian euphemism worth remembering, were supposedly schools for wayward youth. In reality, they were semi-prisons for the underaged poor. Children caught working without a licence could be committed for moral training, meaning months or years behind locked doors, sewing uniforms and memorising Bible verses about obedience. It was hard labour disguised as character development. Even those spared the reformatory weren't safe. Girls faced constant suspicion. Any unsupervised female child on the street risked being labelled immoral. Boys were accused of loitering or petty theft. The very act of standing still too long could earn a trip to court. Victorian London, ever the empire of hypocrisy, couldn't stand to see poverty, yet refused to stop producing it. Newspapers sometimes played both sides. They ran sentimental sketches about the poor little sweep, or the brave match girl, tugging at middle-class heartstrings just enough to sell papers, then turned around and supported new laws to clean up the streets. The public liked its pity sanitised. Compassion was fine in print, less so when the beggar's hand appeared outside the window, and the irony was exquisite. The same empire that bragged about its moral superiority was built on child labour. Factories, mines, shipyards, even the army's supply lines ran on the labour of the underaged. Yet when a child tried to survive independently, selling flowers instead of suffocating in cotton dust, the law came knocking. Freedom, it turned out, was only legal if it smelled of coal and factory grease. By the 1870s and 1880s, reformers began pushing for compulsory education, arguing that schooling would save children from the streets. It was a noble idea, sabotaged by reality. School meant lost income, and no amount of moral lectures could replace an empty dinner plate. Many children attended class in the morning and sold goods at night, creating a new category of criminal, the after-hours pupil. Even education, the supposed cure, became another trap for the poor. The Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act of 1889 finally gave authorities more power, not to help, but to intervene. Parents who relied on their children's earnings could now be charged with neglect. Imagine being fined for letting your child work, while the same government offered no alternative. Victorian lawmakers had perfected the art of punishing poverty while calling it protection. By century's end, London streets were quieter, but not kinder. Many child workers had been forced indoors, into factories, sweatshops and workhouses, where the same exploitation thrived behind walls instead of windows. The streets were clean, the statistics improved, and polite society congratulated itself for saving the children. The children themselves, meanwhile, still worked 14 hours a day, just out of sight. The street trading and child labour laws were not about innocence or virtue. They were about control, about preserving the illusion of order while ignoring the cost. To the Victorians, a poor child was either a future worker or a future criminal. There was no space in between. So yes, a 10-year-old selling matches might have looked like a public nuisance, but the real nuisance was a society that mistook hunger for hooliganism and thought morality could be legislated one arrest at a time. If you've ever thought school felt like a prison, congratulations. You would have fit right in with Victorian children, except theirs came with actual punishments for truancy. The Education Acts of the 19th century were the empire's attempt to turn ignorance into illegality. On paper, they sounded progressive. Education for all. In practice, they meant go to school or your parents go to jail. Education was free, except for the parts that cost money. The idea of public education had been floating around since the early 1800s, when reformers began worrying that the industrial poor might grow up too illiterate to properly operate the machines that exploited them. But it wasn't until the Elementary Education Act of 1810, also known as Forster's Act, that schooling became a national obsession. The goal was noble enough: ensure that every child in England and Wales could attend school, regardless of class. Unfortunately, the Victorians had a remarkable talent for turning good ideas into bureaucratic nightmares. Forster's Act established school boards, local authorities responsible for building schools and enforcing attendance. But here's the catch: those schools weren't free. Parents still had to pay small fees, usually a few pence a week. To the wealthy, this was trivial. To a labourer barely affording rent, it was like being fined for being alive. The poor now had two options: send their children to school and starve a little faster, or keep them home to work and risk prosecution. Either way, the empire's moral conscience could sleep soundly knowing progress was being made. The Attendance Acts that followed tightened the noose. The 1806 Act made school attendance compulsory for children between the ages of 5 and 10, unless they lived more than 3 miles away, because clearly poverty stopped being a problem at 3.1 miles. The Education Act of 1880 made attendance legally enforceable. This was hailed as a triumph of civilization. Britain was finally ensuring that its children would be educated. But for working-class families, it meant something very different: state-sponsored guilt. Imagine you're a Victorian mother. Your husband works 12-hour shifts in a factory, you take in laundry to afford coal. Your 8-year-old son earns a few pennies sweeping streets or selling newspapers. Those few pennies mean bread, warmth, and survival. One morning, the school board officer knocks on your door. Your son isn't in class. Again. You explain he's working so the family can eat. The officer nods sympathetically, then hands you a fine. Congratulations, you're now officially an enemy of progress. Truancy laws turned poverty into a paperwork offence. Parents unable to pay the fines could be dragged before a magistrate, and repeat offenders sometimes faced jail time. The newspapers cheered these examples of moral firmness. Nothing said civilized society quite like imprisoning parents for failing to educate their children in a system they couldn't afford. Even when children did attend, the schools themselves weren't exactly havens of enlightenment. Classrooms were overcrowded, underfunded, and disciplinarian to the bone. Many teachers were barely trained and taught by rote: spelling, arithmetic, and obedience, often in that order. Lessons were designed less to inspire and more to instill conformity. Education was seen as a tool for social control, producing neat rows of future workers who could read factory signs and not riot. Children were divided by gender and class. Boys were prepared for useful trades, girls for domestic virtue, arithmetic for the future clerk, needlework for the future servant. The curriculum was moral as much as mental. Lessons on thrift, cleanliness, and the virtues of knowing your place. God, grammar, and good behaviour, the holy trinity of Victorian schooling. The irony was hard to miss. Parliament poured moral lectures onto the poor about the importance of education while leaving thousands of working families without the means to benefit from it. Some communities built magnificent new schools but forgot to fund teachers or heating. Others enforced attendance so harshly that children went to class in rags, hungry and shivering, learning their letters by candlelight while dreaming of bread. And then there was the school board officer, a figure every working-class child came to dread, the human embodiment of compulsory virtue. These officers, often retired policemen, patrolled neighbourhoods to track down truants. They inspected attendance logs, visited homes, and delivered summonses. For families already juggling poverty, illness, and unemployment, the knock on the door meant humiliation, not help. Of course, the upper classes celebrated these reforms as proof of Britain's moral superiority. Editorials boasted that education would uplift the lower orders. But the unspoken message was clear. Education wasn't about empowerment, it was about discipline. A literate working class was easier to manage. Schools didn't teach rebellion. They taught punctuality, obedience and patriotism, the perfect preparation for factory life or the military. Reformers like Annie Besant and Robert Owen saw through the charade. They argued that real education meant liberation, the chance for a child to grow, imagine, and think freely. But in Victorian Britain, thinking freely was almost as suspicious as loitering. The government preferred orderly progress to enlightenment. Eventually, the 1891 Act introduced free elementary education, sort of. School fees were abolished, but parents still had to supply uniforms, books, and sometimes even coal for heating. Education was free, except for the parts that cost money. And even then, truancy prosecutions continued well into the 20th century. The poor were still punished for every absence, while wealthier families sent their children to private schools with optional attendance and unlimited absences for horse riding. By the end of the Victorian era, Britain congratulated itself on achieving near-universal literacy. The Empire could now proudly say that even its poorest children could read the notices forbidding them from doing anything fun. But beneath the statistics was a story of coercion and contradiction, a system that educated with one hand and penalised with the other. The Education Acts were supposed to open minds, but for the working poor, they mostly opened wallets and court summonses. They weren't a ladder out of poverty so much as another rung to trip over. The Victorians wanted an educated underclass, not an equal one. So yes, by 1900 Britain's children could read, write and recite moral proverbs about virtue and duty. But they also learned another, quieter lesson, that in the empire of rules and respectability, knowledge might be power, but poverty was still a crime. If you ever find yourself nostalgic for the good old days, imagine paying half your wages for a room with 3 walls, a dripping ceiling and a family of rats who think you're the intruder. Welcome to Victorian housing, where the only thing more broken than the floorboards was the legal system meant to protect the tenants. In this era, property was sacred, unless you were the one living in it. If your ceiling collapsed, the law was clear. Try not to be under it. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain's cities into sprawling machines of smoke and survival. London, Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool swelled with workers chasing factory jobs, only to find themselves competing for housing that barely qualified as shelter. The result was the slum, a word that by mid-century was whispered by the middle class the way one might whisper plague. Imagine entire families packed into one room the size of a modern garden shed. No running water, no sanitation, no ventilation, just bodies, damp and despair. The air was thick enough to chew and the smell could outlive memory. Toilets? Shared, if you were lucky. Buckets, if you weren't. The walls were so thin that you could hear your neighbour's baby crying, your other neighbour coughing, and somewhere below, someone quietly dying. And yet people paid for the privilege. Landlords, or slumlords, as history remembers them, carved large houses into tiny rentable rooms. Every square inch was monetised. A single house could contain a dozen families stacked like a human lasagna. It was capitalism's answer to human overcrowding. If there wasn't enough space for decency, at least there was space for rent collection. These landlords were a breed of their own, the invisible aristocracy of misery. Many never set foot in the properties they owned. Agents collected the money, often in cash, often at the doorstep. Maintenance was a foreign concept. Repairs only happened when the structure threatened to collapse onto someone with the means to sue. One London inspector described a tenement where the staircase had rotted completely away, and tenants climbed to their rooms on a borrowed ladder. Another house was discovered with the floor so saturated by sewage that mushrooms were growing out of the boards as sort of nature's protest. And yet, despite these horrors, there were no effective housing laws to protect tenants. The guiding philosophy of the time was that property rights mattered more than human rights. If a tenant complained, the landlord could simply evict them. No notice required, no explanation given. Homelessness was not an injustice. It was a lifestyle choice, at least in the eyes of the well-fed. The state, predictably, preferred to look away. The early Public Health Acts and Sanitary Acts of the 1840s and 1850s focused more on preventing cholera from spreading to rich neighbourhoods than on helping the poor who died from it. Inspectors were appointed, reports were written, and then everything was quietly filed under too expensive to fix. The working class remained wedged between squalor and rent receipts. Occasionally reformers tried to draw attention to the filth. Writers like Henry Mayhew and Charles Dickens exposed the slums in horrifying detail, describing houses so ruinous that light came through the roof in places and rain in others. Philanthropists like Octavia Hill began managing small housing projects with the radical idea that cleanliness and decency might be good for tenants, and even better for landlords in the long run. But these were drops in a very polluted bucket. The Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Act of 1875, championed by Benjamin Disraeli, was the government's grand gesture. It allowed local councils to demolish slums and rebuild healthier housing. In theory, it sounded wonderful. In practice, it was a masterpiece of unintended cruelty. The slums were indeed cleared and were replaced with housing so expensive that the original residents couldn't afford to return. It was gentrification before the word existed, improvement for the city, displacement for the poor. For the average tenant, the law was a joke told by people with servants. Rent control didn't exist. Evictions could happen overnight. There was no obligation for landlords to fix leaks, prevent infestations, or ensure the building wouldn't casually combust. In one notorious case, an entire tenement burned down because a tenant's candle caught a curtain, a tragedy blamed not on the lack of fire escapes, but on reckless working-class habits. The police were no help. They enforced property law, not human decency. Break a window in your own rented room, and even accidentally, and you could be charged with property damage. Die of typhus because your landlord refused to install drainage? Well, at least it wasn't a legal offence. The middle class, peering at the problem through the sanitised lens of newspaper editorials, concluded that poverty itself was the issue, not housing. They published moral essays insisting that cleanliness and good habits would cure all ills. The fact that most tenants didn't have running water or space to hang laundry didn't seem relevant. In Victorian logic, if you were poor and dirty, you were clearly choosing the lifestyle. It wasn't until the Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1890 that local councils finally received power to build affordable homes, though affordable was defined loosely enough to remain aspirational. Even then, the law's implementation was glacial. Most improvements came only after cholera outbreaks or social unrest forced action. Nothing accelerated reform like the threat of disease reaching Mayfair. But beneath the legislative apathy was something deeper: fear. A tenant protected by law might become a tenant who demanded more. Better wages, safer conditions, actual respect. For the Victorian elite, that was far more dangerous than a collapsing ceiling. So the poor stayed where they were, in rooms that reeked of damp and desperation, under roofs that groaned at the weight of hypocrisy. The landlords prospered, the reformers sighed, and the government congratulated itself for investigating the matter. Victorian housing wasn't just a failure of architecture, it was a failure of empathy, wrapped neatly in bureaucracy. The empire built railways across continents but couldn't be bothered to build proper drains for its own citizens. Progress was measured in bricks, not in dignity. In the end, the housing laws of the 19th century were less about shelter than control. They ensured that the poor remained tenants forever, renting space, renting air, renting survival. The British legal system had a simple message for the working class. You may live here, but don't forget you don't belong here. The Victorians adored cleanliness, provided someone else did the scrubbing. To them, hygiene wasn't just a matter of health. It was a moral ranking system. Dirt was sin, soap was salvation, and anyone who couldn't afford the latter clearly deserved the former. Thus emerged one of the most paradoxical crusades in British history, the Sanitation and Public Health Acts, a series of laws designed to purify cities while quietly blaming the poor for being dirty in the first place. Cleanliness was next to godliness, but only if you could afford both soap and rent. Let's set the scene. By the mid-19th century, Britain's booming cities were less modern marvels and more open-air petri dishes. The Industrial Revolution had dumped millions of people into cramped tenements without plumbing, drainage or sunlight. Human waste flowed through gutters, cesspools overflowed, and the Thames itself resembled a giant cup of tepid tea steeped in regret. Cholera outbreaks became the unofficial national sport. In London alone, epidemics in 1832, 1848 and 1854 wiped out tens of thousands. Faced with this stinking catastrophe, Parliament sprang into action, not out of compassion, but because the smell finally reached Westminster. The Great Stink of 1858, when hot weather turned the Thames into a gaseous sewer, made it physically impossible for lawmakers to sit in the House of Commons. Nothing motivates reform quite like the scent of one's own hypocrisy. Enter the Public Health Acts, grandly titled and optimistically vague. The first, in 1848, created a General Board of Health and empowered local authorities to tackle sanitation. On paper, this was progress. In practice, it was a bureaucratic shrug. Towns were encouraged, not required, to clean up. Implementation depended on local enthusiasm, which was usually in short supply. After all, sanitation required taxes, and taxes were deeply offensive to anyone who didn't live next to an open drain. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick genuinely believed sanitation could civilise the masses. His 1842 report, The Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population of Great Britain, was a masterpiece of horror. Detailed accounts of filth, disease and overcrowding, accompanied by the optimistic assumption that cleanliness would breed morality. Clean people are virtuous people, he declared, as if a bar of soap could erase centuries of inequality. And so, under the flag of public health, local councils began enforcing sanitary regulations, but mostly on the poor. Inspectors were dispatched to improve working-class neighbourhoods, poking through homes, ordering repairs and issuing fines. If your house smelled bad, you could be punished. If your cesspit overflowed, it wasn't a public failure, it was a personal one. The rich, meanwhile, were left uninspected. Their servants took care of any unpleasant realities before they reached the nostrils of authority. The sanitary laws soon evolved into a peculiar mix of genuine progress and class surveillance. Street cleaning, drainage projects, and refuse collection all improved. But the costs were often passed directly on to tenants. Landlords raised rents to cover new requirements, and when tenants couldn't pay, they were evicted. It was progress by displacement. The poor were driven from the filth, not freed from it. To make matters worse, the rhetoric around sanitation became moralistic. Reformers began speaking of moral miasma, the idea that poverty itself emitted a kind of spiritual stench. Cleanliness, wrote one social commentator, is a duty to God and Queen. Which was convenient because both seemed equally unreachable to those living on a labourer's wage. The message was clear. If you're poor and dirty, you're not just unsanitary, you're ungodly. Public health campaigns expanded in the 1860s and 1870s, driven by urban planners who believed hygiene could be legislated into existence. New waterworks and sewer systems were built, most famously Joseph Basil Jett's London sewers. an engineering marvel that finally gave the city's waste somewhere to go other than everywhere. It was one of the great achievements of the century, and yet, predictably, it did little for those who couldn't afford the connection fees. The poor were still left with pumps, buckets, and wishful thinking. The Public Health Act of 1875 consolidated previous laws, giving local governments more power to regulate sanitation, housing, and disease control. It was hailed as a landmark victory for civilization, but in classic Victorian fashion, enforcement often meant surveillance. Sanitary inspectors roamed working-class districts, measuring ventilation, counting privies, and issuing stern lectures about morality disguised as hygiene. If you were poor and coughed, you weren't sick, you were suspect. Women bore the brunt of these inspections. Mothers were scolded for unclean habits when their homes flooded with sewage. Housewives were lectured about washing floors they couldn't afford soap to clean. In some areas, inspectors arrived unannounced to educate families on proper hygiene, an experience best described as involuntary embarrassment. The empire had found a way to moralise housekeeping. Meanwhile, the wealthy adopted cleanliness as fashion. Soap manufacturers advertised their products as the mark of refinement, and the middle classes turned hygiene into virtue signalling. Bathing became not just a habit, but a social statement, proof that one was civilized, respectable, and definitely not poor. Even perfume was rebranded as moral armor, masking the faint odor of hypocrisy. Of course, not all sanitary reform was sinister. Public baths and washhouses did open, offering affordable access to cleanliness for working people. But even these came wrapped in shame. Notices reminded users to behave respectably and limit washing time. Some facilities even banned mixed bathing for fear that cleanliness might lead to moral impurity. By the end of the century, Britain's cities were undeniably cleaner, but the line between sanitation and social control remained as pungent as ever. The poor still lived in overcrowded housing, still lacked basic plumbing, and still paid fines for the privilege of being blamed. Cleanliness had become a weapon of class warfare, wielded by people who believed that poverty was a personal odour to be scrubbed away. In truth, the Sanitation and Public Health Acts were never just about drains and disease, they were about visibility. The Victorian elite didn't want to fix the poor, they wanted to deodorise them. The goal was not equality, but distance, a society so well scrubbed that the stench of injustice could no longer reach the parlour. And so the empire marched proudly into modernity, soap in one hand and a summons in the other, purifying the poor one fine at a time. If there was one thing the Victorians feared more than revolution, it was someone showing up underdressed for it. In a society where appearance equalled morality, how you looked mattered far more than who you were. The upper classes spent fortunes perfecting the illusion of virtue through fashion, while the poor were punished for the crime of looking like themselves. The Victorian motto was simple: dress poor, get arrested; dress rich, get photographed. In the 9th century, Britain was obsessed with respectability, that fragile blend of cleanliness, class, and clothing that supposedly proved your soul's value. A man's moral worth could be measured by the shine on his boots, a woman's virtue by the number of ribbons on her bonnet. But for the working class, these weren't charming eccentricities, they were survival tactics, because in the eyes of the law, looking improper could get you fined, detained, or worse. The roots of this madness lay in centuries-old sumptuary thinking, the belief that social order depended on people dressing their class. Medieval kings had once legislated what colours and fabrics commoners could wear. Victorians revived that same spirit with a moral twist. The law might not have forbidden silk outright anymore, but it certainly punished poverty made visible. Police regulations and local ordinances gave constables wide discretion to stop anyone who appeared disreputable, idle, or improperly attired. The language was intentionally vague, elastic enough to criminalise almost anything. A woman in worn clothes walking alone? Possible prostitute. A man in rags lingering too long near a shop window? Potential thief. Someone barefoot? A vagrant. Appearance became evidence, and evidence was guilt. This obsession with visual virtue turned the streets into moral catwalks. For the poor, dressing decently wasn't vanity, it was camouflage. A clean collar or patched coat might mean the difference between being treated as a human being or as public nuisance. Many working-class families spent absurd proportions of their income on clothing, not because they were frivolous, but because society demanded it. Respectability had become the most expensive form of insurance. For women, the stakes were even higher. The Victorian mind loved to equate femininity with morality, and morality with modesty. A woman's outfit was essentially a confession written in fabric. Too much skin, immoral. Too much ornamentation, indecent. Too plain, suspect. The line between respectable lady and streetwalker was often just a matter of hem length, and for working-class women who couldn't afford layers of lace, it was a daily gamble. Police and magistrates routinely arrested women on appearance alone. The Contagious Diseases Acts, already infamous for targeting suspected prostitutes, dovetailed neatly with these unspoken dress codes. In practice, any woman without the uniform of middle-class propriety, a bonnet, gloves, and at least a pretence of finery, risked being detained for solicitation. The crime wasn't what she did, it was what she looked like she might do. Men faced their own version of fashion policing. The respectable man was expected to be clean-shaven, neatly dressed, and obviously employed. A labourer out of work, his clothes frayed and boots scuffed, might find himself stopped for vagrancy. A beggar wearing a patched coat could be charged with impersonating the respectable. In one 1870 case, a man was arrested for dressing above his station after borrowing a discarded gentleman's jacket. Apparently, social mobility was acceptable only when it didn't involve second-hand tailoring. Even children weren't spared. Street urchins, barefoot, ragged, and perpetually filthy, became the favourite targets of both moral reformers and the police. Charitable societies called them the waifs of sin, as though dirty knees were a gateway to damnation. The irony, of course, was that the same newspapers printing sermons on child virtue also sold illustrated papers featuring idolised working-class types, the romanticised flower girl or the plucky bootblack. The poor were picturesque in art, scandalous in person. Fashion itself became a form of propaganda. For the wealthy, clothing symbolised discipline and divine order. For the poor, it symbolised failure. This wasn't just about style, it was ideology. The rich could display excess without shame because their wealth supposedly proved moral superiority. The poor were expected to dress modestly, but not too modestly, lest they be mistaken for paupers. A servant's appearance reflected on their employer, so even those in service were forced to spend what little they had on maintaining a polished facade. And heaven help anyone who fell between the cracks. The lower middle class, clerks, shopgirls, governesses, lived in perpetual dread of looking common. They scrimped for gloves, starched collars, and the newest hat styles, terrified of sliding backward into visible poverty. It was class anxiety disguised as fashion sense. One etiquette manual advised that a lady's reputation may hang by the thread of her hemline, which, in hindsight, was less metaphor and more warning label. Even the charities that aimed to uplift the poor enforced dress codes. Soup kitchens and mission halls required attendees to appear respectably attired, which rather missed the point. Some workhouses refused entry to applicants whose clothes were too tattered, declaring them beyond rehabilitation. In other words, no shoes, no salvation. By the late 19th century, appearance had become a form of moral currency. Reformers began promoting ragged schools and clothing drives to make poor children look presentable, not necessarily warmer or healthier, just less offensive to middle-class sensibilities. Being clean and decently dressed was the ticket to charity, employment, and basic respect. Poverty itself wasn't the scandal, looking poor was. The press fueled the obsession. Illustrated magazines and fashion columns turned the middle-class wardrobe into a moral compass. Proper dress, wrote one editorial in 1887, encourages right thinking. Perhaps that's why the era produced so many tailors and so few revolutionaries. And yet, amid all this pretense, the streets still belonged to the poor. Rag pickers, hawkers, costermongers, and flower sellers brought colour and chaos to the city, defying the government's dream of uniform respectability. Their patched clothes and makeshift hats became badges of defiance, accidental fashion statements in a world allergic to authenticity. In the end, Victorian Britain's war on improper dress wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control. Clothing was the empire's easiest form of censorship, a visible leash around invisible hierarchies. The rich could cloak their sins in silk. The poor wore theirs as evidence. So next time you see a photograph of some solemn Victorian gentleman in a three-piece suit, remember, that starched collar wasn't just fashion. It was armour in a world where morality was tailor-made and priced accordingly. Victorian Britain liked to think of itself as a beacon of civilization, an empire of order, restraint and punctuality, which explains why it got so nervous after sunset. In daylight, poverty could be managed through polite ignorance. At night, however, it became visible. Workers heading home, street vendors packing up, women walking alone. Suddenly, everyone looked suspicious. And so the state came up with a brilliant solution. Don't fix the poverty, just ban it after dark. If you're walking home at 10 p.m, you're either a criminal or lost, both punishable by law. The 19th century was an age obsessed with control, and nowhere was that clearer than in its policing of nighttime life. Gaslights may have brightened the cities, but they also cast longer shadows, perfect for policing the poor. From London to Liverpool, a web of curfews, night laws and local regulations sprang up, designed to make sure the streets stayed respectable once the sun went down. Of course, respectable was code for expensive. By the 1840s, industrial cities were booming, and so were anxieties about what their new working populations might do after work. Reformers and magistrates wrung their hands over nocturnal mischief, public drinking, gambling, prostitution, singing, and worst of all, conversation. The poor, it seemed, simply couldn't be trusted to behave under the moonlight. The authorities feared that one late-night song could turn into a riot, and one gathering of factory workers might become a revolution. So towns passed street regulations limiting when certain people could be outside. Some areas imposed curfews on servants, labourers and idle persons. In practice, this meant anyone whose clothes didn't suggest a carriage waiting around the corner. Police were authorised to stop and question anyone walking alone at night, particularly in wealthier neighbourhoods. The question was always the same: what are you doing out at this hour? There was no right answer. Going home sounded evasive. Working late sounded improbable. Breathing might be considered defiance. Even children weren't exempt. Street laws often prohibited juveniles from being out past certain hours, a noble attempt to keep them safe by arresting them. Newspaper reports tell of 12-year-olds hauled before magistrates for wandering after dark. The irony, of course, was that many of these children worked night shifts in factories, markets, or as errand runners for wealthier households. If poverty didn't tire you out, the police would. The Vagrancy Acts, already criminalizing homelessness, took on new life after dusk. Anyone sleeping outdoors risked arrest, but anyone walking outdoors risked the same. Being poor in daylight was bad. Being poor at night was practically subversive. The police justified it all as maintaining public order. The public in question, however, consisted mainly of people who could afford locked doors and curtains thick enough to muffle the sounds of poverty. Meanwhile, the upper classes enjoyed the night freely. London's West End thrived on evening leisure. Opera houses, gentlemen's clubs, glittering dinner parties, and scandalous midnight rendezvous. Respectable society's nocturnal habits were as loud as they were legal. You could drink champagne until dawn in a private ballroom without consequence, but heaven help the man selling roasted chestnuts outside it after midnight. The divide wasn't between night and day, it was between privilege and visibility. The curfews had practical benefits for those in power. They kept labourers from organising. Nighttime was one of the few hours working people actually had to gather, talk and vent. Employers and lawmakers alike feared the potential of after-hours discontent, so the police were instructed to break up any groups loitering after dark, whether they were discussing politics or just sharing a loaf of bread. The mere sight of several working-class men together at midnight could trigger a public assembly charge. For women, the laws were even crueler. Any woman alone on the street after certain hours risked being labelled a prostitute. Respectable women were supposed to be at home, asleep, or safely escorted. A working woman, say a seamstress walking home late, was automatically suspicious. The infamous street-walking arrest made no distinction between sex work and survival. Victorian justice had one rule for women after dark. Innocence had a curfew, and you'd better know when it was. Some districts went further, instituting literal bells and patrols to announce curfew hours. In parts of industrial Birmingham and northern mill towns, night watchmen walked the streets, driving away undesirable persons. The definition of undesirable was flexible enough to include half the city. The wealthy praised these efforts as signs of civic improvement. The poor called it what it was, harassment with a schedule. Even so-called public safety laws came with a moral twist. Gaslights, hailed as symbols of progress, were strategically placed to illuminate shop fronts and theatres, rarely the alleys or back streets where working families lived. Darkness was allowed to cling to poverty like a second skin. When crime inevitably occurred there, newspapers cited it as proof of moral failure rather than neglect. "The slums breed vice," wrote one editorial in 1806, ignoring that the city refused to fund lamps for them. By the late 19th century, curfew regulations had crept into the language of respectability itself. Manuals of urban conduct warned readers against nocturnal wandering, even suggesting that a person's hour of movement reflected their moral standing. A good citizen went home early, a questionable one didn't. And if a policeman disagreed with your timetable, well, the magistrate's court opened bright and early. Not that everyone obeyed. London's poor developed their own nighttime economy, hawkers selling cheap food, musicians busking by lamplight, and match girls walking in pairs for safety. These were the ghosts of empire, visible only when someone wanted them gone. The authorities called it urban disorder. The people called it Tuesday. By the turn of the century, as electric lights and modern policing expanded, curfews became less formal but no less effective. The laws lingered in new forms, loitering statutes, public nuisance acts, and police discretion. Nighttime remained a privilege, not a right. In the end, the Victorian curfews revealed the empire's greatest fear. Not darkness, but democracy after dark. It wasn't the hour that mattered. It was who was allowed to exist in it. For the rich, night was an adventure. For the poor, it was evidence. So if you were a Victorian labourer heading home at 10 p.m, you had two choices: walk quickly and look invisible, or stop and look guilty. Either way, the police might decide you were both. Victorian Britain loved rules almost as much as it loved hypocrisy, and nowhere was that more evident than in its obsession with food. The wealthy dined on exotic meats and delicate pastries, while the poor were jailbird for expired cabbage. In an empire that prided itself on progress, the government managed to invent a new kind of cruelty, regulating hunger itself. By the 19th century, food wasn't just nourishment. It was a marker of class, morality, and status. A roast pheasant said, "I am virtuous and well-bred." A boiled potato said, "I'm trying." Anything cheaper than that said, "Call the constable." While Britain's upper classes spent their evenings feasting in candlelit dining rooms, the lower classes were fighting for crumbs in the markets, literally. And those crumbs were now subject to the law. The empire's free market was anything but free. If you were poor and tried to make an honest living selling food, you entered a bureaucratic battlefield. The market and street trading acts demanded licenses for anyone selling produce, bread, or cooked goods in public. On paper, this was about ensuring quality and order. In practice, it was about keeping the poor out of sight and out of business. Licenses cost money, and inspections cost more. For a street seller barely surviving on a few shillings a week, it was an impossible expense. Yet, the streets were full of sellers anyway. You couldn't walk through London, Manchester, or Birmingham without hearing the calls of hawkers. Hot pies, ripe apples, two a penny. These were the sounds of survival. Women sold shellfish from buckets. Children offered cress or matches. Men pushed carts of vegetables through the fog. They were the living heartbeat of the city, and also, apparently, its greatest threat to civilization. Municipal authorities saw unlicensed traders as dangerous nuisances. Police were given orders to fine or arrest them for obstructing the highway or unlawful vending. The result was almost comedic if it weren't so cruel. Entire families hauled into court because they sold wilted lettuce without paperwork. Magistrates described these traders as idle and disorderly, conveniently ignoring that they were literally working. And it wasn't just the selling that was criminalised, it was the quality of what was sold. The Adulteration of Food Acts, beginning in the 1860s, were meant to protect consumers from fraud. In theory, this was a good idea. Nobody wanted chalk in their flour or arsenic in their sweets, but enforcement focused less on the factories producing contaminated food and more on the poor vendors caught reselling leftovers. A grocer who diluted milk might get a warning. A woman selling stale bread for half price to feed her neighbours? Fined for unfit goods. In some cities, police raids on markets became regular spectacles. Officers tipped over stalls, confiscated food, and arrested anyone without the correct licence badge. The newspapers dutifully applauded these efforts to maintain public decency, because nothing says decency like arresting a widow for selling carrots. Behind the crackdown was a deeper fear, not of food poisoning, but of independence. Street sellers were hard to control. They didn't pay rent to landlords or wages to factory owners. They were self-employed, self-reliant, and occasionally loud about it. The authorities preferred their poor indoors, silent and supervised. A marketplace full of defiant traders was too close to democracy for comfort. Meanwhile, the same government that fined poor women for selling wilted vegetables turned a blind eye to the upper-class culinary atrocities happening in their own dining rooms. The wealthy imported oysters from France, game from Scotland, and sugar from Caribbean plantations worked by enslaved or impoverished labourers. They poured claret by the gallon while lecturing the poor about temperance and thrift. If the rich got sick from overeating, it was indulgence. If the poor got sick from hunger, it was moral for failure. And yet, despite the harassment, the street food trade refused to die. The poor adapted with the ingenuity born of desperation. Some hawkers operated on the move, darting through alleys before the police could catch them. Others worked under the radar, borrowing licences from friends or bribing inspectors with small coins and free pies. London's markets, Billingsgate, Covent Garden, Smithfield, became theatres of defiance, where traders shouted, bargained, and joked their way through the day, knowing the next constable might ruin them. The irony was that for all the state's moralising about clean food, the poor often had no choice but to eat what others discarded. Bakers sold yesterday's loaves at reduced prices, meat vendors rebranded grey beef as family cuts, and vegetable sellers mixed fresh produce with rot to stretch profits. The authorities called this fraud. The poor called it Tuesday dinner. Even the reformers couldn't agree on what to do. Some argued for public markets to be built with fair rents and clean facilities. Others, predictably, thought the poor should learn restraint. One committee report solemnly advised the working class to avoid purchasing street food of uncertain quality, as though hunger were a choice between menus. By the late 19th century, food policing became one of the empire's favourite pastimes. Inspectors measured loaves, sampled milk, and confiscated questionable meat. They almost always targeted small traders instead of large suppliers, because the latter had lawyers. The system, like everything else Victorian, was dressed in virtue but fueled by hypocrisy. Still, the people resisted. Street food remained the sustenance of the masses. A warm pie at dawn, a mug of pea soup for a penny, a baked potato steaming through the smog. These vendors fed entire neighbourhoods when no one else would. And yet, to the law, they were criminals, too visible, too poor, too defiant. In the end, the food and market regulations weren't really about public health. They were about public image. The Victorians wanted their cities to look orderly and prosperous, even if that meant hiding the hunger behind fines and arrests. The wealthy dined on exotic meats and imported wines. The poor were jailed for expired cabbage. And somewhere between those two meals lay the real flavour of Victorian justice, bitter, bureaucratic, and always served cold. If you have ever had a bad day at work, spare a thought for the Victorian pickpocket who stole a loaf of bread and woke up in Australia. Because in 9th century Britain, crime didn't just pay, it travelled. Welcome to the age of penal transportation, the empire's most inventive way to deal with poverty, by shipping it somewhere else. The logic was simple. Why address inequality at home when you could just mail it overseas? The transportation laws turned Britain's judicial system into a travel agency for the desperate. Beginning in the 18th century and continuing well into the Victorian era, courts sentenced over 60,000 men, women and children to penal colonies, most famously Australia. The punishment was framed as humane, a reformative alternative to hanging. But let's be clear, transportation was exile with a side of hard labour and tropical despair. As one contemporary joked bitterly, steal a loaf, win a one-way cruise to the other hemisphere. By the early 1800s, Britain's prisons were overflowing. Industrialisation had created millions of new workers and, consequently, millions of new ways to criminalise them. Petty thefts, vagrancy, debt, poaching, and trespassing, crimes born of hunger, filled the dockets. But the gallows were falling out of fashion. Public executions were starting to look a bit medieval and bad for tourism. So Parliament came up with something more civilised. Send the poor far, far away. Transportation was supposed to reform offenders through labour. The colonies, officials claimed, would benefit from useful convicts who could help build new societies. In practice, this meant turning ships into floating prisons and exiles into unpaid construction crews. Each voyage took months, crammed with disease, filth and despair. By the time they reached Australian shores, many convicts were half dead. The rest were promptly worked the rest of the way. The crimes that earned this tropical vacation were often laughably small. Steal a handkerchief, 7 years. Snatch a loaf of bread, 10. One 14-year-old boy was transported for stealing a single silver spoon, another for picking up an abandoned piece of rope. Britain's courts were a factory of tragedy running on bureaucratic efficiency, and the hypocrisy was astonishing. The same empire that preached Christian mercy sent starving families halfway around the globe in chains. Judges spoke solemnly about moral improvement while sentencing mothers to transportation for pawning clothes to feed their children. The poor were told exile was a lesson. The rich were told it was necessary for maintaining order. In truth, both explanations stank of convenient moral perfume. Once in Australia, convicts entered a brutal hierarchy. The worst offenders went to penal settlements like Norfolk Island or Port Arthur, places described by survivors as hell with better weather. Prisoners were flogged, starved, and forced to build roads, bridges, and buildings under a punishing sun. Lesser offenders worked as assigned servants, leased out to colonial settlers who treated them like property. Imagine being forced to do unpaid labour for a man whose biggest achievement was not being poor enough to get caught. Yet even in exile, class followed them. Educated convicts, clerks, forgers, and unlucky gentlemen were often given lighter duties, sometimes even clerical work for colonial administrators. Manual labourers, thieves and prostitutes were sent to the fields or the quarries. The empire may have moved its convicts across oceans, but it never misplaced its social hierarchy. Transportation also became a convenient myth for the upper classes, a moral parable of redemption through suffering. Pamphlets and sermons celebrated the reformed convict, who became a model settler, conveniently ignoring the thousands who died of disease, starvation or despair. It was redemption by a spreadsheet. If one or two success stories survived, the system could be called a triumph. For the poor left behind, transportation was less a punishment and more a constant threat. A reminder that the line between survival and banishment was razor thin. Families were torn apart, children were left orphaned or dumped in workhouses. Wives of transported men were told to remarry, as though their husbands had simply evaporated into imperial necessity. Letters, if they arrived at all, took months, thin paper ghosts crossing half the world. And yet, As with so many Victorian injustices, the government insisted it was all for the greater good. Transportation, they claimed, relieved prison overcrowding, deterred crime, and spread civilization. The fact that it also provided free labour for Britain's expanding colonies was treated as a happy coincidence. Every convict sent abroad was, in bureaucratic terms, a useful export. Empire building had never been so cost-effective. By the mid-19th century, however, the cracks began to show. Australia itself started to complain. The free settlers, those who'd come willingly, didn't appreciate their new neighbours arriving in chains. Newspapers called transported convicts moral contagion. The colonies wanted workers, not felons. Meanwhile, reformers back home began arguing that exile did nothing to address the roots of crime, poverty, unemployment, and inequality. As one critic put it, we send men to the ends of the earth to reform them when what they needed was bread at home. Gradually, transportation was phased out. New prisons were built in Britain, and punishments shifted toward hard labour and solitary confinement, cruelty brought conveniently local. The last convict ship to Australia sailed in 1868, ending a 70-year experiment in moral geography. The Empire congratulated itself on ending a barbarous practice, as though it hadn't spent decades perfecting it. For those who had survived the journey, Australia became both prison and home. Many convicts eventually earned pardons or settled as free men and women. Some prospered, others simply disappeared into the outback. The irony? Their forced labour helped build the foundations of modern Australia: roads, ports, farms, and even towns. The Empire's outcasts had, quite literally, constructed a new world for their betters to later discover. But back in Britain, little changed. The laws that had made transportation necessary, those that criminalised poverty, remained firmly in place. The poor might no longer be shipped across oceans, but they were still trapped in slums, debtors' prisons, and workhouses. The map had changed, the cruelty had not. In the end, transportation was less about justice and more about convenience, a moral loophole that allowed Britain to claim civilization while outsourcing its conscience. It was empire in miniature, orderly, efficient, and mercilessly unfair. So yes, steal a loaf and win a one-way cruise to the other hemisphere. The ticket was free, the price was everything else. If there was one thing the Victorians distrusted more than bad hygiene, it was collective enthusiasm. The Empire could tolerate hunger, filth, and plague, but heaven forbid people gathered to talk about it. The 19th century saw Britain turn free speech into a spectator sport, legal in theory, punishable in practice. The Riot and Assembly Acts were the government's favourite tools for reminding the poor that freedom of expression came with fine print. Free speech was legal, as long as you didn't say anything inconvenient. The fear of mobs had been baked into British law since the Riot Act of 1714, which was, quite literally, a script. When crowds gathered, a magistrate would read aloud a declaration beginning with, "Our sovereign lord the king chargeth and commandeth all persons being assembled immediately to disperse." If people didn't leave within an hour, they could legally be shot. The Victorians inherited this with enthusiasm and updated it for their industrial age, a new world where riot now meant working-class complaint. By the early 1800s, the Industrial Revolution had replaced farm tools with factory whistles and created an army of overworked, underpaid labourers. Wages stagnated, rent climbed, bread prices soared, and the government's response was, as ever, to outlaw being angry about it. Gathering in public to discuss grievances, demand better pay, or simply exist in large numbers was now unlawful assembly. The poor didn't need revolutionaries to destroy society, they just needed a meeting that ran past lunch. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 revived and expanded in early Victorian enforcement, made it illegal for workers to form unions or collectively bargain. Employers could meet, scheme, and fix wages to their heart's content. But if two coal miners so much as discussed striking over unsafe conditions, they could be arrested for conspiracy. The logic was flawless. Coordination was dangerous unless it involved dinner parties and investments. When workers ignored this, as they frequently did, the government called in troops. Industrial towns like Manchester, Birmingham and Sheffield became laboratories of repression. The most infamous example came in 1819, when a peaceful crowd gathered in St. Peter's Field to demand parliamentary reform. The local magistrates panicked and sent in the cavalry. The result, later called the Peterloo Massacre, left at least 15 dead and hundreds injured, killed not by revolution, but by the fear of one. Britain congratulated itself on maintaining order. After Peterloo, the government doubled down with the Six Acts in 1819, a legislative iron curtain designed to suffocate dissent. These laws restricted public meetings, censored radical newspapers, and empowered police to preemptively arrest anyone with too many opinions. They made sure that freedom of speech remained a right enjoyed primarily by those too wealthy to use it. By the mid-19th century, the industrial age had produced a new kind of threat, the organised worker. Trade unions, despite being technically illegal, were growing in number and defiance. Workers realised that while one man could be ignored, 10,000 were harder to overlook. Parliament called this mob pressure. The poor called it Tuesday. The Public Order Acts and municipal bylaws gave police extraordinary power to disperse crowds likely to disturb the peace. That phrase, likely to, was the Spurious clause in Victorian English. You didn't have to actually riot, you just had to look like you might be thinking about it. Singing protest songs, waving banners, or even assembling without prior permission could get you hauled before a magistrate. And then came the Chartists, the first mass political movement of the working class. Their demands were laughably reasonable: universal male suffrage, secret ballots, fair representation. The government responded as though someone had suggested storming Buckingham Palace. Demonstrations were banned, petitions confiscated, leaders arrested. In 1848, when tens of thousands of Chartists planned a peaceful march in London, the authorities flooded the city with troops and barricades. The army's presence was so overwhelming that one satirical newspaper reported, "The only safe place to hold a meeting is in Parliament itself, where the law cannot reach." Even charitable or educational gatherings risked suspicion. Night schools, reading circles and workers' clubs were monitored by police spies looking for subversive literature. A man teaching literacy in a factory district might wake up to find himself accused of inciting discontent. The state didn't just fear rebellion, it feared awareness. Of course, yes, the upper classes were free to assemble whenever they pleased. Gentlemen's clubs, hunting parties, and investment syndicates operated without question. A crowd of labourers in a public square was anarchy. A crowd of lords in Mayfair was tradition. Victorian Britain's motto could have been same behaviour, different tailoring. The church joined the chorus, preaching obedience as virtue. Sermons urged workers to be patient and trust in providence, preferably while continuing their shifts. The meek shall inherit the earth, clergy reminded them, conveniently omitting that the inheritance would not include mineral rights. And when protests did break through, when hunger, wage cuts or injustice pushed people beyond fear, the government responded with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Troops, mounted police, and even artillery were deployed to suppress unrest. The Rebecca riots in Wales, the Plug riots in Lancashire, the swing riots among agricultural labourers, all were crushed under the banner of maintaining peace. The peace of the rich, naturally. The irony, of course, was that the Victorian state prided itself on constitutional freedom. Britain congratulated itself for not having revolutions like France, while ensuring that anyone who tried to start one here didn't live long enough to compare notes. Officials called it stability, historians call it repression with paperwork. By the late 19th century, pressure from reformers and labour leaders finally began to loosen the grip. The Trade Union Act of 1871 legalised unions at last, but even then, strikes could be declared conspiracies in restraint of trade. The message remained clear: you were free to have rights, provided you didn't try to use them collectively. In the end, the Riots and Assembly Acts revealed the Victorian government's favourite trick: confusing order with obedience. To the ruling class, a silent population was proof of contentment. The poor, however, knew better. Silence was just the pause between sentences of injustice. So yes, in Victorian Britain, free speech existed, so long as you whispered it, indoors, preferably into a teacup. Anything louder was treason with echo. If the Victorians could have taxed kindness, they would have. In fact, they nearly did. The charity laws of 19th century Britain managed the extraordinary feat of turning compassion into contraband. In a society that claimed to worship benevolence, helping the poor without a license was considered a threat to civilization. In Victorian Britain, giving to the poor without permission was basically organised rebellion. The problem, at least from the government's perspective, was that too many people wanted to help. Poverty was everywhere, visible, miserable, and impossible to ignore. But while middle-class reformers could host charity dinners, the poor helping one another was apparently disorderly conduct. You couldn't just hand out bread or money on a street corner. That sort of anarchy had to be controlled. After all, if generosity spread unchecked, what next? Equality? The roots of this absurdity lay in the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, the cornerstone of Victorian social cruelty. It centralised relief, replacing local compassion with bureaucratic suspicion. Under its rules, all official charity was to be managed through the workhouse system, grim institutions that treated hunger as a moral failing. Private charity, meanwhile, was heavily discouraged, especially if it came from anyone without property or status. The logic was both simple and appalling. According to Parliament, unregulated charity encouraged dependency. If people received help too easily, they might become lazy, or, worse, hopeful. So the state built a machine of moral accounting. Relief was to be discipline, not kind. Workhouses were deliberately unpleasant, designed to deter all but the desperate. If you were poor and proud enough to avoid them, you had to rely on charity. But even that now came with red tape. Under the Charitable Donations Acts and various local ordinances, individuals or groups distributing aid had to register with local authorities or church overseers. Unauthorised giving could be fined or shut down. Parish officials monitored who gave to whom, ensuring no one abused generosity by, heaven forbid, surviving twice on 2 different handouts. If a kindly widow handed out soup to beggars from her doorstep, she risked being accused of encouraging vagrancy. And yes, people were arrested for charity. Police reports from the 1840s and 1850s tell of street preachers and reformers fined for distributing food without permission. In London, volunteers who handed out bread near the Strand were charged with obstructing the highway. In Liverpool, a woman who gave coins to beggars was warned by police that she was perpetuating idleness. To help the poor, one had to first prove that the poor deserved it. This obsession with deservingness defined Victorian philanthropy. The poor were divided into 2 categories: the deserving poor, meaning the elderly, widows and orphans, and the undeserving poor, sindung, meaning everyone else. A starving labourer who'd lost his job wasn't unlucky, he was defective. A mother begging for food wasn't desperate, she was negligent. Charity became less about helping and more about moral sorting. Enter the Charity Organisation Society, COS, founded in 1869, which aimed to coordinate and purify charity by removing sentiment from it. They believed spontaneous generosity was dangerous. True charity, they said, should be scientific. Every applicant for aid was investigated, their morals audited, their habits scrutinised. Did they attend church? Were they sober? Did they keep a clean home? Only then, and only through official channels, could they receive assistance, usually after several weeks of evaluation. The COS was the bureaucratic soul of the age, suspicious of kindness, terrified of compassion without paperwork. They argued that haphazard giving led to pauperism. Their pamphlets warned against indiscriminate almsgiving, which they claimed encouraged laziness and deceit. Essentially, the poor were con artists until proven otherwise. Meanwhile, the government passed laws to regulate even how charity could look. Soup kitchens and relief societies required permits. Outdoor food distribution was often banned for fear it might attract crowds and therefore revolution. Street missions had to seek approval from parish councils. Even hospitals and orphanages faced inspections to ensure their funds weren't misapplied. The empire had turned mercy into an administrative procedure. And yet, while the state criminalised spontaneous kindness, it glorified organised philanthropy, as long as it came from the top down. Aristocrats built model villages and endowed almshouses, their generosity immortalised in plaques and press coverage. The poor feeding the poor, however, was a moral hazard. A duchess could give blankets to miners and be praised in the Times. A seamstress giving soup to her neighbours might find herself warned by a constable. Charity, in the Victorian imagination, was not about lifting others up but keeping them in their proper place. It was an instrument of control, another way to reinforce hierarchy. Accepting aid meant accepting judgment. Recipients were expected to express gratitude, humility, and visible repentance. There was even a phrase for it: the deserving poor should be thankful. The rich, by contrast, were thanked publicly for proving their goodness with other people's survival. And of course, religion played its part. The church was a key enforcer of moralised giving. Parish charities provided relief only to those deemed pious and obedient. One priest famously refused aid to a family because the father had missed Sunday service. He was working, ironically, to feed his children. Helping the unrepentant, the clergy warned, was helping Satan's work. Apparently, the devil operated on an empty stomach. The result was a society where compassion was conditional and bureaucracy was sacred. Even the word charity began to change. It stopped meaning generosity and started meaning supervision. The poor were no longer people to be helped. They were problems to be managed. Yet despite the state's efforts, underground kindness persisted. Workers pulled coins to bury neighbours, women shared food quietly between tenements, and radical preachers handed out bread to anyone who asked. These small acts of rebellion, illegal, unregistered, unapproved, were the real soul of Victorian charity. They proved that empathy survived even under regulation. By the end of the century, the contradictions had grown too obvious to ignore. Reformers began calling for public welfare based on rights, not charity, what would eventually evolve into social assistance. But in the Victorian era, kindness was still a dangerous act. So yes, in the empire of manners and morality, feeding the hungry could get you fined, and compassion needed a committee's approval. It was the perfect metaphor for Victorian justice, a nation that outlawed pity and called it order. Victorian Britain liked to think of itself as the world's workshop, but only if you could afford the entry fee. In an empire that claimed to celebrate industriousness, the government made sure the poor could only admire work, not legally perform it. Welcome to the era of trade licensing laws, where ambition required paperwork, craftsmanship required cash, and poverty required permission. If you couldn't pay the license, you couldn't earn the money to pay for it. A flawless system. The Industrial Revolution had birthed a new generation of workers, tinkerers, tailors, barbers, cobblers, hawkers, bakers, and every variety of small-time entrepreneur. These weren't wealthy factory owners or financiers. They were ordinary people trying to survive on skill and sweat. But in a society obsessed with regulation, that independence made them suspicious. Anyone who worked for themselves was, by definition, uncontrolled. And in Victorian Britain, nothing terrified the ruling class more than a poor person who didn't need supervision. Enter the licensing system, a labyrinth of fees, inspections, and moral judgments designed to maintain order, but really to strangle the working poor in red tape. Almost every trade imaginable required a license. Want to sell bread? License. Cut hair? License. Mend boots? License. Sell apples from a cart? License. Even fortune tellers, musicians, and rat catchers, yes, rat catchers, were expected to register and pay annual fees to the local authorities. The stated reason for all this bureaucracy was noble on paper: to ensure quality and prevent fraud. In reality, it ensured two things: that the poor stayed poor and that the state got its cut. Licences were often priced well beyond the means of small workers. The cost of a hawker's licence could equal a month's wages. A publican's licence could bankrupt a family before the first pint was poured. It was capitalism dressed as morality, a government that preached self-reliance while charging rent on survival. If you couldn't afford the licence, and most couldn't, you had two options: risk working illegally or starve legally. Unsurprisingly, most chose the former. The streets of Victorian cities swarmed with unlicensed traders, shoeblacks, flower sellers, chimney sweeps, knife grinders, and women selling baked potatoes from coal-heated tins. They weren't criminals by choice, they were entrepreneurs by necessity, but to the police and magistrates they were nuisances. Inspectors patrolled markets and alleys like bureaucratic predators, checking licences and issuing fines. A missing piece of paper could mean a week's pay gone, or worse, a night in jail. In London, one 1872 report described an epidemic of unlicensed cobblers, as if men mending shoes to feed their families were a public health emergency. The courts agreed. Working without a licence was treated as moral disorder, evidence of idleness, dishonesty, or both. And of course, the law was never applied evenly. Wealthy tradesmen could buy multiple licences and monopolise entire professions, but the poor, already burdened with rent, taxes and survival, couldn't even afford entry. The licensing system became a class filter disguised as law, a way of ensuring that every occupation from selling beer to baking bread stayed safely in the hands of those who already had money. It didn't stop at trades. Even the humble street performer, the organ grinder, the fiddler, the singer, needed a licence to entertain. Without one, they could be fined for creating a public nuisance. Imagine being punished for trying to make people smile. Though to be fair, given the Victorians' idea of fun, smiling might have been illegal too. The system's absurdity reached its peak with the Peddlers Act of 1871, which required anyone selling goods door to door to register with the police. Applicants had to provide proof of good character, references, and, naturally, a fee. Failure to comply could result in arrest or confiscation of goods. One historian wryly noted that the law did not so much regulate peddling as criminalise walking with intent to sell. The licensing laws also gave local authorities enormous power to decide who could work. Certain trades were denied to women entirely, while others required moral certification. A single accusation of impropriety could cost a licence, which meant losing your livelihood. For widows and single mothers running tiny stalls or laundries, one complaint from a jealous competitor or a disapproving constable could end everything. Poverty, once again, was policed under the guise of propriety. And as always, the rhetoric came drenched in moral perfume. Officials argued that licensing protected the public from unscrupulous dealers. Reformers claimed it elevated the dignity of labour. But the poor quickly learned that the only dignity involved was the kind you had to pay for in advance. In truth, these laws were less about protecting consumers than protecting established business owners, the very people who lobbied for them. The rich loved the system. Licensing meant less competition from upstart artisans and fewer market stalls cluttering the view from their carriages. The police loved it too. It gave them a legal reason to control the poor without calling it persecution. Every missing permit became an excuse for arrest, every unpaid fee a sign of criminal character. One magistrate even described licensing enforcement as a civilising mission. Civilising apparently meant ensuring that the poor never became self-sufficient. Still, the people resisted in small, ingenious ways. Unlicensed trades flourished in the cracks of the law. Hawkers worked under false names. Tailors stitched by candlelight behind shuttered windows, and street vendors operated in pairs, one to sell, one to keep watch for the constable. The poor learned to navigate bureaucracy like guerrilla fighters in a war of paperwork. By the late 19th century, critics began to see the system for what it was, a machine that punished ambition. Reformers argued that licensing was strangling small enterprise, turning the industrious poor into criminals. A few laws were softened, fees were reduced, but the damage had already been done. A generation of would-be craftsmen and traders had been taught that independence was not a virtue, it was a liability. The licensing system's genius was that it criminalized not laziness but effort. It turned the act of working into a privilege instead of a right. The poor didn't need welfare, they needed permission to exist. In the end, the Victorian state perfected the art of paradox. It praised the self-made man while making it illegal to start from nothing. The government claimed to promote honest labour, but licensed it out like an exclusive club. To survive, the poor had to become both worker and outlaw, industrious enough to toil, clever enough to avoid the inspector, and lucky enough not to get caught. So yes, if you couldn't pay the licence, you couldn't earn the money to pay for it. The Victorians called that order. History calls it what it was, bureaucracy with a badge. In theory, Victorian Britain adored the image of blind justice, the noble lady of fairness with her scales and sword. In practice, she wasn't blind, she was short-sighted and corrective lenses were far too expensive. Justice was blind, mostly because she couldn't afford glasses. For all its speeches about morality, fairness and the dignity of law, Victorian Britain operated a courtroom economy where verdicts could often be predicted by looking at a person's wallet. The rich bought leniency, the poor bought tickets to prison. The law claimed to be impartial, but it spoke fluent money. Let's start with the basics. Going to court cost money. Filing a complaint, defending yourself, or even attending proceedings often required fees. Lawyers had to be paid, documents stamped, and fines deposited. For the wealthy, this was a minor inconvenience. For the poor, it was an instant disqualification. Many working-class defendants couldn't afford representation, so they faced judges alone, usually in courts where the magistrates were landowners, industrialists, or gentlemen with about as much understanding of poverty as they had of plumbing. Courtrooms were microcosms of the empire's class hierarchy. At the top sat the judge in a powdered wig, embodiment of authority, patience, and property ownership. Below him, always him, a jury of respectable middle-class men. And at the bottom, both literally and metaphorically, the defendant, a coal miner, a servant, a laundress, or a child, staring up at a justice system that treated them as a social disease. The difference in treatment was stark. A gentleman caught embezzling thousands might be sentenced to a fine or a few comfortable months in a debtor's wing. A dock worker caught stealing a loaf could be shipped to Australia. The courts called this proportionate sentencing. Historians now call it financial profiling with a gavel. Even the supposed minor cases reeked of inequality. In magistrates' courts, where most petty offences were heard, the judge's discretion was law. That discretion often translated to rich equals mistake, poor equals menace. A young aristocrat caught drunk and disorderly was a spirited youth. A labourer in the same state was a danger to public decency. The only difference between mischief and moral collapse was tailoring. Then there were the court fees and fines, those masterstrokes of circular cruelty. The poor were fined amounts they could never possibly pay, which meant imprisonment. Once jailed, they were charged for food and lodging in prison. Upon release, they were still in debt, which could get them rearrested. It was a judicial merry-go-round powered entirely by poverty. The system even monetised punishment. Magistrates' courts relied on fines as a source of local revenue, meaning there was a quiet incentive to convict. The more people were found guilty, the healthier the municipal budget looked. It was like running a casino where the house always wins, and the losing bets were human beings. The wealthy, by contrast, had their own invisible get-out-of-jail-free cards, influence, and character. Respectable citizens could produce letters of reference from clergymen or employers swearing to their moral integrity. Judges loved those. A man of good character, they'd note, as though the character could be measured in acres or dividends. The poor, of course, had no such advocates. Their references were hunger and exhaustion, neither of which impressed the bench. Lawyers were another luxury of privilege. Barristers charged fees that could feed a family for months. The The poor relied on poor man's counsel, volunteer attorneys or sympathetic clerks who might squeeze in a defence between better-paying clients. Most didn't have one at all. Trials could last 5 minutes, verdict included. Imagine being found guilty of theft in less time than it takes to boil an egg. And even when the poor won their cases, the system made sure it didn't count as victory. Civil courts were full of cases where workers sued employers for unpaid wages or injuries, and lost because they couldn't afford the right paperwork. In rare instances, when they won, they were awarded damages so small they barely covered the cost of taking a day off work. Justice for the poor was not so much served as tastefully withheld. The press, ever loyal to the social order, played its part. Newspapers reported upper-class trials as tragic dramas of temptation and moral struggle, while working-class cases were written like police reports. A gentleman's crime was regrettable. A servant's was predictable. Public sympathy followed the money like a bloodhound in a silk collar. Some reformers saw the problem and tried to fix it. The County Courts Act of 1846 introduced small local courts meant to simplify legal access for ordinary people. It was a good idea, swiftly ruined by bureaucracy. Filing fees remained high, judges remained classist, and the same double standards endured. One observer dryly noted, "The poor may now approach justice more easily, though she remains as expensive to embrace." The deeper issue, though, wasn't just economic, it was moral. The Victorians genuinely believed poverty was a form of deviance. A poor person in court wasn't merely accused of theft or disorder. They were accused of being poor, of failing to embody the national virtues of thrift, sobriety, and self-control. The law wasn't there to protect them. It was there to teach them their place. This moral arithmetic infected every verdict. The wealthy were redeemable. The poor were repeat offenders waiting to happen. Judges lectured labourers about self-discipline, as though moral sermons could replace bread. One famously told a starving thief, "You must learn to resist temptation." The man replied, "Yes, my lord, but not hunger." By the late 19th century, the hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. Scandals involving corrupt magistrates, bribed juries, and lenient sentences for society's elite exposed the myth of impartiality. Reform movements began calling for legal aid, fair wages for jurors, and the right to appeal. The law slowly and grudgingly began to modernise, but its class prejudice lingered like smoke in the wallpaper. For most Victorians, the courtroom was not a place of justice, but a stage where inequality was publicly confirmed. The rich left through the front door with their dignity intact, the poor left through the back in chains. So yes, justice was blind, all right. But not because she was impartial, she just couldn't afford glasses, and the optician charged by the class. The empire may have crumbled, the soot may have washed from the bricks, and the workhouses may have turned into museums, but the ghost of Victorian law still lingers in the corridors of policy and politics. The wigs are gone, the gallows are gone, but the logic remains hauntingly familiar. Victorian Britain may be gone, but its legal ghosts still whisper, "You're poor? Sounds like a you problem." The 19th century didn't just shape an empire. It engineered a moral blueprint for how society would treat poverty for the next 200 years. Every cruelly worded law, every fine for hunger, every regulation on survival built the foundation for a modern world that still confuses justice with judgment. The Victorians may have traded public hangings for paperwork, but the outcome feels eerily similar. The poor still get punished for existing inconveniently. Let's start with the biggest legacy of all, the idea that poverty is a personal failure, not a structural one. The Victorians perfected the narrative that the poor were morally defective, lazy, drunk, or simply unworthy of comfort. They wrapped cruelty in virtue and called it moral improvement. Modern politics took notes. Today's soundbites about welfare dependency, benefit scroungers, or personal responsibility are just Victorian sermons repackaged in high definition. The accents have changed, the contempt has not. The 1834 Poor Law may have died on paper, but its spirit reincarnated in austerity policies, means testing and endless bureaucracy designed to make seeking help as humiliating as possible. The Victorian workhouse has become the modern benefits office, minus the porridge but with more paperwork. Applicants are still interrogated for the crime of needing help, and assistance often arrives only after one's pride has been thoroughly processed and stamped. Then there's housing, that grand old British tradition of punishing the poor for not owning land. The slums of Victorian London were demolished long ago, but their moral architecture remains. Today's affordable housing crisis is built on the same foundation. Landlords profit, tenants suffer, and governments express concern at regular intervals without ever upsetting the rent-collecting classes. The Victorians invented overcrowding as a side effect of greed. Modern society has turned it into an investment opportunity. Victorian Britain also pioneered policing poverty, a legacy that survives in spirit if not in name. Back then, vagrancy laws criminalized homelessness. Today, cities deploy hostile architecture and anti-loitering ordinances to achieve the same result. Spikes on benches, sprinklers under bridges, and bans on sleeping rough are the contemporary version of the 1830s constable nudging a beggar awake. The tools are shinier, but the message is identical. If you can't afford a home, don't you dare exist where people can see you. Even the obsession with licenses and fees lives on. The Victorian street trader needed permits to sell a potato. The modern gig worker needs 10 digital hoops to deliver one. The same bureaucratic chokehold that kept a cobbler poor in 1850 now throttles freelancers, small traders, and anyone without a corporate safety net. Self-employment remains the same beautiful idea, so long as it pays taxes and doesn't clutter the streets. The justice system, too, carries its ancestors' fingerprints. Victorian courts fined the poor for theft and rewarded the rich for theft with better manners. Modern courts may have better lighting, but wealth still determines the verdict. From bail to sentencing, legal outcomes correlate neatly with income. The only difference is that now we've replaced the magistrate's sneer with data-driven sentencing models. Algorithms are just Victorian judges that run on electricity. Even charity, the crown jewel of Victorian hypocrisy, remains alive and judgmental. The Victorians believed that help should be earned through obedience and gratitude. Today, the same spirit animates charity culture. Food banks sponsored by billionaires who cause the hunger they claim to relieve, philanthropy that doubles as PR. Victorian morality taught that giving should never empower the recipient. Modern charity still prefers to comfort the donor. And yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of all is the illusion of progress, the comforting lie that we've moved beyond such injustices. The Victorians built railways and prisons side by side, factories and workhouses as twin monuments of modernity. Likewise, we build skyscrapers and call it social progress, while rough sleepers huddle beneath their glass shadows. We design smart cities that somehow can't find room for affordable homes. Technology evolves. Empathy seems to have stayed in 1840. The language has simply been rebranded. What was once pauper management is now social welfare optimization. What was public nuisance is now antisocial behaviour. Victorian policymakers would be impressed by how efficiently we've automated their cruelty. They had to hire inspectors to humiliate the poor. We've built apps that do it for free. Of course, not everything is grim. There has been progress. Child labour is illegal. Public health is a right mostly. And workhouses are museum exhibits instead of active threats. But progress is not the same as equality. The legal DNA of Victorian classism remains embedded in our systems. Poverty is still treated as evidence of failure, not a symptom of exploitation. The poor are still asked to prove their worthiness before receiving help. And society still prefers punishment to prevention, because prevention would require confronting power. The Victorians believed poverty was God's way of teaching humility. We've secularised the sentiment but kept the syllabus. The result is a world where inequality feels normal and empathy feels extravagant. It's the same old empire, just with better branding. So when we look back at the 19th century and laugh at its absurdities, the debt prisons, the workhouses, the moral lectures about soap, we might pause before feeling too superior. Because the next time someone says, if they just worked harder they wouldn't be poor, you're hearing the echo of a Victorian magistrate in a modern suit. Victorian Britain may be gone, but its laws didn't die. They evolved into policy, into prejudice, into polite conversation. The only thing we really abolished was honesty. The empire is dust, but the hierarchy is still hiring. And somewhere in the quiet bureaucracy of modern poverty, those ghosts are still whispering, "You're poor? Sounds like a you problem."